Welcome back. What you're about to hear aren't just stories, they're memories, echoing through the fog of war. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe and tell me where are you from and what time are you watching. Now, get comfortable. The rain is already falling, and the stories are on their way.
Sturmmann Friedrich Weber, 24 years old. 5th Sturm Battalion, born in Dresden, Saxony. The shells fell like iron rain, each impact shredding reality a little more. I lay pressed against the mud wall, watching as dirt particles danced in the air between explosions. Time had fractured. In the lulls between detonations, I could count heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, before the next blast collapsed the world again. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I checked my Mauser's bolt action for the 20th time in as many minutes. They're coming. The voice belonged to Unteroffizier Hoffmann, though it seemed to travel through water before reaching me. I raised my head above the trench lip and saw them. French infantry emerging from mist and smoke, their bayonets catching the cold morning light. They moved in unnatural rhythm, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. I fired, watched. A figure crumple worked the bolt, fired again. My body performed its duty while my mind hovered somewhere above, watching this mechanical dance of death with detached curiosity. A shell landed 3 meters away, and suddenly I was flying, spinning through a world turned sideways. Colors smeared across my vision, and sounds stretched into bizarre, warbling tones. I landed hard, tasting blood and soil, uncertain where my body ended, and the churned earth began. And then came the screaming. Was it mine? The morning of April 9th, 1917, had begun like many others on the Western Front, near Saint-Quentin. Our Sturmbataillon had been positioned in the forward trenches for 6 days, preparing for the coming offensive. The spring. Air carried a bitter chill, and a fine mist hung over no man's land, shrouding the wire tangles and shell holes in ghostly white. I had joined the elite Sturmtruppen 4 months prior, leaving my regular infantry regiment for what promised to be a more active role. We were Germany's answer to the stalemate of trench warfare. Specially trained shock troops who would spearhead attacks with infiltration tactics, bypassing strong points to disrupt enemy communications and support. Our kit reflected our purpose. Instead of the standard Pickelhaube or the newer steel Stahlhelm, we wore specially designed assault helmets with smaller profiles. Each man carried a Mauser rifle, stick grenades, and an entrenching tool sharpened to serve as a close-quarters weapon. Some were armed with the brutal efficiency of flamethrowers or the new MP-18 submachine guns, though ammunition shortages meant these were precious few. My squad consisted of 8 men led by Unteroffizier Hoffmann, a former carpenter from Munich, with a methodical approach to killing. Beside me in our dugout sat Bauer, a farm boy who somehow maintained his bulk despite our rations, and Kleinmann, a former university student who quoted Goethe while cleaning his rifle. The others, Fischer, Müller, Schultz, and Weber, were veterans who viewed me with the standard mixture of tolerance and skepticism afforded to replacements. At 0430, Captain Ritter gathered the company. He was a stern Prussian who spoke in clipped, precise orders. Sturmbataillon, he addressed us, his breath visible in the cold air. Today we demonstrate why the Kaiser selected you for this honor. The artillery will begin preparation at 0500. You move at 0545. First wave will advance to the enemy's forward trenches and clear resistance. Second wave bypasses to disrupt communications and artillery positions. Questions? There were none. We drilled the approach countless times. For the fatherland, he concluded, and we dispersed to our positions. I checked my equipment one final time. 3 stick grenades secured to my belt. Ammunition pouches full. Gas mask in its canister. Entrenching tool sharpened to a wicked edge. Bread ration in my pocket, though my stomach knotted too tightly to consider eating. Beside me, Kleinman muttered something about the Valkyries, his eyes fixed on the misty expanse of no man's land. At precisely 0500, our artillery opened up. The barrage was unlike anything I'd experienced. Hundreds of guns firing in coordinated fury, the shells screaming overhead like tortured spirits. The earth trembled continuously, and I pressed myself against the trench wall, trying to make my body small. The sound wasn't merely loud. It physically assaulted us, pressing against eardrums until they threatened to rupture. Hoffman shouted something, but his words vanished into the cacophony. He resorted to hand signals, pointing to his watch and holding up 5 fingers, then making a forward motion. 5 minutes until we went over the top. I nodded, my mouth desert dry. The steel helmet felt suddenly inadequate, a child's toy against the industrial slaughter awaiting us. I recalled my father's pride when I'd enlisted, his certainty that the war would be over by Christmas. That was 1914. Now it was 1917, and the only certainty was that men would continue dying in mud and wire for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract. "Ready yourselves," Hoffman bellowed, somehow making his voice heard above the artillery. I fixed, my bayonet with trembling hands, the metal socket clicking onto my rifle barrel with finality. Beside me, Bauer crossed himself, his large fingers making the sign with practiced ease despite his Lutheran upbringing. 30 seconds. My heart hammered against my ribs. The world narrowed to the ladder rungs before me, the only path forward. Sturmtruppen. Forward. We moved as one, clambering up the ladders and spilling over the lip of the trench. The barrage had lifted, shifting to targets deeper in enemy territory. The sudden relative quiet was disorienting, punctuated only by distant explosions and the sound of boots on wet earth. We advanced through the mist in loose formation, moving at a steady trot rather than the suicidal charge of earlier offensives. This was the Sturmbataillon way. Tactical movement, using terrain for cover, bypassing strong points to maintain momentum. No man's land spread before us, a lunar landscape of craters filled with stagnant water, snarls of barbed wire, and the unburied dead from previous attacks. The first French machine gun opened up from our right flank, the distinctive chatter of the Hotchkiss cutting through the mist. Fisher dropped immediately, a puppet with cut strings. The rest of us hit the ground, crawling toward the nearest shell hole. The mud clung to us like a living thing, sucking at equipment and making each movement a struggle. Hoffman gestured to Müller, who carried the flamethrower. They broke left, while signaling the rest of us to provide covering fire. I sighted my Mauser on the approximate location of the machine, gunned and fired repeatedly, working the bolt with mechanical precision. Bauer did the same beside me, his large frame half submerged in filthy water. There was a whoosh and roar as Müller's flamethrower came to life, followed by screams that didn't sound human. The machine gun fell silent. Hoffman waved us forward. Again, and we resumed our advance, moving from crater to crater. The French front line appeared through the mist, a jagged tear in the earth reinforced with sandbags and wooden supports. We approached to within 30 meters without drawing fire, suggesting our artillery had done its work well. Then a single rifle shot cracked, and Kleinman grunted. Beside me, clutching his shoulder, "Now!" Hoffman shouted. We pulled grenades from our belts, yanked the cords, and hurled them toward the trench in a single coordinated motion. The explosions came seconds later, followed by cries of pain and fear. Forward, forward. We charged the final distance, leaping into the trench amid smoke and confusion. This was the moment when training took over, when thought became an impediment. I landed on a French soldier struggling to fix his bayonet, drove mine into his chest before he could react, then wrenched it free with a twisting motion. The man's face registered surprise more than pain, his mouth forming a perfect O as he slid down the trench wall. The fighting in the trench was intimate and savage. The confined space made rifle work impractical, so we resorted to bayonets, entrenching tools and pistols. Schultz cleared a dugout with a grenade, the explosion sending debris and body parts into the trench. Bauer grappled with a French officer, finally subduing him with massive farmer's hands around the man's throat. I moved mechanically through the chaos, stabbing, shooting, ducking, moving. A French soldier lunged at me from a side passage. I parried his bayonet with my rifle and swung my entrenching tool in a desperate arc, feeling the sharpened edge bite into his neck. Hot blood sprayed across my face, metallic and warm. The man crumpled, his eyes still open and somehow accusatory. Time became elastic, stretching and contracting with each heartbeat. I couldn't say how long we fought in that trench. Minutes or hours, it made no difference. Eventually, Hoffman's whistle cut through the din, signaling that our section was cleared. Second wave, continue advance. First wave, consolidate, he ordered. Half our unit pushed forward, disappearing into communication trenches that led to the French rear areas. The rest of us began the grim business of securing our position, setting up captured machine guns, creating firing positions, searching the dead for intelligence materials. The French counterattack came at 0730, preceded by their own artillery barrage. I huddled in a dugout with Bauer and Kleinman, whose shoulder wound had been hastily bandaged. The world above us disintegrated under the bombardment, great gouts of earth thrown skyward as shells found their mark. The wooden supports of our shelter creaked ominously, dust and dirt raining down with each nearby impact. "They're targeting their own trenches," Kleinman observed with academic detachment, wincing as he adjusted his position. "Remarkable, the willingness to destroy what one has built." Bauer spat into the corner. "Shut up with your philosophy. They're trying to kill us. Nothing remarkable about it." I said nothing, counting the shells, estimating their caliber from the sound of their flight and detonation. French 75mm field guns mostly, devastating in their accuracy and rate of fire. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like days. When it lifted, Hoffman's voice bellowed from somewhere above. "Positions! They're coming!" We scrambled up the dugout steps and into the shattered trench. Parts of it had collapsed entirely, burying Schultz and Weber. The rest was barely recognizable as a military position, more a series of connected craters than an engineered fortification. Through the smoke came the French infantry, advancing in waves behind a rolling barrage. I sighted my rifle and fired methodically, watching men fall mid-stride. Beside me, Bauer manned a captured Hotchkiss, its distinctive metallic rattle joining the cacophony of combat. Kleinman fired one-handed, his wounded arm tucked against his body. The French pressed forward despite their losses, their blue uniforms appearing almost black in the smoke-filled light. They reached the wire, what remained of it, after our artillery, and became entangled. We cut them down systematically, our fire disciplined and effective. Still they came, climbing over their fallen comrades, pushing ever closer to our position. A shell landed directly on our section of trench, and the world disappeared in concussive force and flying debris. I found myself thrown against the rear, wall half buried in collapsed earth. My ears rang painfully and blood trickled from my nose. Bauer lay nearby, unmoving, his large frame partially covering Kleinman. I crawled toward them, dragging myself through mud thick with blood. Bauer was dead, the back of his head a ruined mess. Kleinman lived, trapped beneath his comrade's body, eyes wide with shock and pain. More explosions, closer now. The French were using rifle grenades, dropping them into our position. I pulled Kleinman free and dragged him toward a partially collapsed dugout entrance. We tumbled down the steps as another grenade detonated above, showering us with splinters and earth. In the dim light of the dugout, Kleinman's face appeared ghostly, streaked with blood and dirt. "Are they coming?" he whispered. I nodded, checking my rifle and finding it still functional. "They're coming." "How many of us left?" I shook my head. "Don't know. Bauer's gone. Can't see Hoffman or the others." Kleinman laughed, a disturbing sound in the confined space. "So this is how it ends. Buried alive in another country. The sounds of combat grew louder above us. French voices called to each other, terribly close now. I positioned myself. At the bottom of the steps, rifle aimed upward, and waited. Footsteps approached the dugout entrance. A shadow fell across the opening. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared in the confined space, and the shadow disappeared with a cry. I worked the bolt, chambering another round, and waited. More shadows, more shots. My world contracted. To the small circle of light at the top of the stairs, the weight of the rifle in my hands, the mechanical repetition of aim, fire, work the bolt. I lost count of how many times I fired, how many shadows fell. Then came the grenades. One bounced. Down the steps toward us, a small metal egg trailing a thin streamer. Without thinking, I threw myself on top of it, expecting oblivion. The grenade was a dud. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for an explosion that never came. Then I began to laugh, quietly at first, then with increasing hysteria. Kleinman stared at me as though I'd gone mad. Perhaps I had. A second grenade followed the first, landing beside me. This one worked. I awoke in a field hospital 3 days later, my body a catalogue of injuries, shrapnel wounds, burns, a concussion. Kleinman had not survived. Neither had Hoffman or the others. I was the sole survivor of our squad, saved by the partial collapse of the dugout that had buried me beneath enough debris to shield me from the worst of the blast. The doctor spoke of sending me home, of wounds sufficient to warrant discharge. I said nothing. How could I explain that I no longer knew where home was? That my mind remained in that dugout, eternally waiting for the next shadow to fall across the entrance? That in my dreams, the grenades kept falling, endless variations of the same moment stretched into infinity. They called it shell shock, this detachment from reality. A convenient medical term for the soul's rebellion against what men should. Never witness, never do. The doctors promised recovery with time and rest, but time had fractured for me on that April morning. Between each tick of the clock now lived shadows and whispers, the faces of men I'd killed and friends I'd lost. The trenches had claimed more than flesh. They had claimed my perception of reality itself. The war continued without me. Other men took my place in the Sturmbattalion, advanced through other trenches, lived or died in mud and wire. I watched it all from a distance, trapped in the shadow between seconds, waiting for a detonation that never came. Oberjäger Franz Keller, 24 years old. 2nd Bavarian Jäger Battalion, Alpine Corps. Born in Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. The scope's cold eye shows me everything and nothing. Through its circle, the world shrinks to a single point of focus. An Italian officer gesturing to his men from what he believes is a secure position behind a rock outcropping at 380 meters. His mustache twitches as he speaks. I can almost read his lips. The crosshairs settle. On the soft hollow of his throat, just above his collar. My breathing slows to nothing. The mountain air hangs still between us. My finger caresses the trigger of my Gewehr 98, feeling the smooth curve of cold steel. I am death incarnate, invisible, patient. The officer turns slightly, presenting his profile. Perfect. I exhale halfway and hold. Then I see it again. The shadow person standing beside him. A formless black silhouette with no features, just watching, waiting. I blink hard, trying to clear my vision. When I look again, the shadow is gone. But so is my perfect shot. The officer has moved. I curse under my breath, the taste of metal filling my mouth. This is the third time this week the shadows have appeared in my scope. Dr. Hoffman says they're not real, just my mind fracturing under the strain. But I know what I see. The dead walk these mountains. They stand beside the living, waiting to guide them across. And lately, they've started following me too. The Dolomites, October 1917. Our battalion had been positioned along a series of ridgelines overlooking the Italian positions for nearly 3 weeks. The weather had turned, bringing early snow and biting winds that howled through the passes like tortured souls. It was sniper country, perfect terrain for those of us trained to kill from distances that seemed impossible to regular infantry. I had been a hunter before the war, like most boys from Berchtesgaden. My father taught me to track chamois across the steep mountain, faces when I was barely tall enough to hold his old Mauser. Patience is the hunter's true weapon, he would say. The gun is just a tool. Those lessons served me well when they put a sniper rifle in my hands and pointed me toward the Italians. Our forward observation post was a natural cave set into the mountainside, enlarged and reinforced by our engineers. 3 of us operated. From here, myself, Gefreiter Weber, who served as my spotter, and Jäger Hecht, who maintained communications with our main position half a kilometer back. We had been an effective team, credited with 38 confirmed kills over the past month. The cold was our constant companion, seeping into our bones despite the layers of wool and fur. We kept a small stove burning when we could, but fuel was precious, and smoke could give away our position. Most days we simply endured, wrapped in our mountain cloaks, taking turns at observation. Movement at Sector 4, Weber whispered. His eye pressed to the spotting scope. Infantry patrol, about squad strength, range approximately 450 meters, moving east along the lower trail. I shifted into position, sliding my rifle onto its rest and adjusting my body to align with the weapon. The Gewehr 98 was a precision instrument when properly maintained, capable of consistent accuracy at ranges that would have seemed magical before the war. Mine had been specially modified with a scope, the stock carefully shaped to my measurements. Wind, 3 kilometers from the west, Weber continued. Slight downslope angle, 12 degrees. I made the necessary adjustments, feeling the familiar calm descend over me as I settled into the rhythm of the hunt. Through the scope, I could see them clearly. 8 Italian soldiers picking their way along a narrow path. They moved cautiously, but not cautiously enough. Their officer led from the front, a brave but foolish position. "Officer first," I murmured. Then the radio man. Weber grunted in agreement. The radio man would be their link to reinforcements or artillery support. Taking him out would isolate the patrol. I tracked the officer's movement, waiting for him to pause. Patience. The gun is just a tool. In my scope, the world narrowed to the small frame of magnified reality. Rocks, scrub pines, and men who did not know they were already dead. The officer stopped, raising his hand to halt the patrol. He turned to speak to someone behind him, presenting his left side to my position. I exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger with deliberate pressure. The rifle bucked against my shoulder. Before the sound of the shot had echoed away, I was already cycling the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. Through the scope, I saw the officer collapse, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. The patrol scattered, diving for cover. The radio man wasn't fast enough. My second shot caught him as he attempted to drop behind a boulder. 2 men down in less than 5 seconds. "Good shooting," Weber said, his voice flat. "They're in disarray. 1 is trying to apply a bandage to the officer, but he's gone. 3 taking cover behind the rock formation at your 2 o'clock. 2 retreating down the path. The last one, I can't see him." I scanned through my scope, finding the 3 soldiers. Weber had indicated they were bunched too closely together, making themselves an easy target. Poor training or panic. Either way, it would cost them. "Shifting to the group of 3, I said, adjusting my aim. And that's when I saw it for the first time. A dark figure standing among them. Not a soldier, not anything human. Just a shadow, vaguely person-shaped, but featureless and black as pitch. It seemed to be looking directly at me, though it had no face. I jerked back from the scope, blinking hard. "What is it?" Weber asked, glancing at me. "Nothing," I said. "Reflection in the scope, maybe." When I looked again, there was nothing unusual. Just 3 terrified Italian soldiers trying to make themselves invisible against the mountainside. I took a deep breath and refocused. The first shot struck the tallest of the 3 in the shoulder, spinning him out from behind his cover. The second caught him in the chest as he fell. The remaining soldiers had seen enough. They broke cover and ran, zigzagging down the path toward their lines.
At that range and speed, they weren't worth the ammunition. "Let them go," I said. "They'll spread the word. This route isn't safe." That was our real job. Not just killing enemy soldiers, but denying them freedom of movement, forcing them
to take longer routes, keeping them nervous and off balance. Fear was a more effective weapon than bullets when properly applied. We waited another hour to ensure no reinforcements were coming before beginning the careful process of relocating. Snipers never fired more than a few shots from the same position. Survival depended on movement. As we packed our equipment, Hecht received a message from headquarters. He decoded it quickly, his expression darkening as he read. "Heavy Italian counterattack expected tomorrow at dawn," he said. "All units. To prepare defensive positions, we're to move to Observation Point 7 and provide targeting information for the artillery." Observation Point 7 was another kilometer up the ridge, a precarious perch that offered excellent visibility but little protection. The climb would be treacherous in the failing light, but orders were orders. "We move in 10 minutes, said, checking my rifle one last time before slipping it into its protective canvas case. The mountain was already deep in shadow as we made our way along the narrow trails. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering the rocks and making each step a potential disaster. One slip could mean a fall of hundreds of meters onto the jagged rocks below. We moved in silence, conserving our breath in the thin air. The shadow followed us. I glimpsed it at the edge of my vision, a darker patch against the gathering darkness, keeping pace without apparent effort. I said nothing to the others. There was no point. Either the shadow was real, and there was nothing we could do about it, or it existed only in my mind, which was a different kind of problem entirely. We reached Observation Point 7 as the last light faded from the sky. The position was little more than a shallow depression beneath an overhanging rock, but it would shield us from view and provide some protection from the wind. We established our observation post quickly, working with practiced efficiency despite the cold that numbed our fingers. "I'll take first watch," I said. "You two get some rest." Weber nodded gratefully, wrapping himself in his blanket and settling against the rock wall. Hecht did the same after setting up the field telephone that would connect us to the artillery, battery positioned 3 kilometers behind our lines. I positioned myself at the observation point, adjusting my night optics. The Italian lines were visible as a series of faint lights and occasional flares that illuminated the valley below. Through my scope, I could make out movement, troops and supplies being brought forward in preparation for the morning's attack. The night was cloudless, stars burning with cold fire in the black void above. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of a distant rifle or the whisper of wind through the rocks. In such moments, the war seemed distant, almost irrelevant against the eternal mountains. The shadow stood at the edge of the overlook, gazing down at the Italian positions. It was more distinct now, more clearly formed. In the darkness, it seemed almost solid. "What are you?" I whispered, my breath fogging in the cold air. The shadow didn't respond or acknowledge me in any way. It simply watched, as I watched, patient and still. A flare burst over the valley, casting everything, in harsh white light for a few seconds. When my vision adjusted, the shadow was gone. I told myself I was tired, that the mind plays tricks when exhausted. But I knew better. Something had found me on this mountain, something that had no business in the world of the living. Dawn brought the expected attack. The Italians came forward in waves, their artillery preceding them with a thunderous barrage that shook the mountainside. Through my scope, I counted their companies, identifying officers and machine gun teams for our artillery to target. 3. Coordinates 3742, infantry concentration, fire for effect. Hecht relayed into the field telephone. Moments later, Austrian shells rained down on the specified coordinates, throwing earth and bodies into the air. I watched dispassionately, calling out new targets as they appeared. It was different from my usual work, less personal, more mechanical. Instead of individual lives taken with precision, this was slaughter on an industrial scale. The shadow appeared among the Italian troops, moving among them as shells exploded and men died. It seemed to be searching for something or someone. I watched it through my scope, forgetting momentarily about spotting targets. "Keller, we've got officers at point 39, Weber shouted, breaking my trance. I forced my attention back to the battle, identifying the officer's position and relaying it to Hecht. More shells, more death. The cycle continued for hours as the attack broke against our defenses like waves against a cliff. By midday, the Italians had withdrawn, leaving their dead and wounded scattered across the approaches. We had done our job well. The enemy had gained nothing but casualties. That night, as Weber and Hecht slept, I sat alone with my thoughts and my unwanted companion. The shadow stood at the edge of our position, looking out toward the enemy. Lines. It seemed more substantial with each passing day, as though it were gradually forcing its way into the world. "Are you death?" I asked quietly. "Is that why you're here?" The shadow turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze. For the first time, it moved deliberately in response to me. It raised an arm, pointing not toward the Italian lines, but back toward our own positions. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold ran through me. Before I could question further, a message came through on the field telephone. Hecht stirred, answering it groggily. "Change of orders," he said after listening for a moment. "We're to return to battalion headquarters immediately. The line is shifting." The news was unexpected but not unwelcome. 3 weeks in this forward position had taken its toll on all of us. Even a brief respite at headquarters would be a chance to properly warm up, eat hot food, and perhaps sleep without one eye open. We gathered our equipment quickly and began the journey back, moving along a different route to avoid possible enemy patrols. The shadow followed, always at the edge of my vision, never fully visible when I turned to look directly at it. Battalion. Headquarters was established in a small village that had been abandoned early in the fighting. The buildings were damaged but still offered better shelter than we had known for weeks. The company commander, Hauptmann Dietz, briefed us on the situation. "The Italian offensive has failed along the entire front," he explained, pointing to a map spread on a table before us. "We're consolidating our positions in preparation for our own advance. Your team has been selected for a special operation." The special operation turned out to be an infiltration mission. A group of our best mountain troops, including our sniper team, would move through a supposedly impassable section of the range to establish positions behind the Italian lines. From there, we would disrupt their supply routes and communications before the main offensive began. It was dangerous work, but exactly the kind of mission the Alpine Corps had been formed to undertake. We spent the day preparing, gathering specialized equipment and studying detailed maps of the terrain we would traverse. That night, I dreamed of the shadow. In the dream, it had a face, my face, but with empty sockets where the eyes should be. It spoke with my voice, telling me things I couldn't remember upon waking. I startled awake before dawn, sweating, despite the cold. Weber noticed my condition at breakfast. "You look like hell, Keller," he said, pushing a cup of ersatz coffee toward me. "Are you ill?" "Just tired," I replied. "Haven't been sleeping?" "Well," he nodded, accepting the explanation without question. We had all experienced sleep disturbances after long periods at the front. It was one of the many ways the body and mind rebelled against the unnatural conditions of war. Our team joined 10 other specially selected men for the mission briefing. The route would take us through a series of narrow passes and along ridgelines that were considered too treacherous for military movement. That was precisely why we had chosen it. The Italians would not be watching for an approach from that direction. We moved out at dusk, climbing through the gathering darkness. The shadow walked among us, though I appeared to be the only one who could see it. It moved with purpose now, sometimes getting ahead of our column as if eager to reach our destination. The journey was as difficult as expected. Twice men nearly fell to their deaths when handholds crumbled or footing gave way on the icy rocks. We climbed in silence, each man focused entirely on survival. War seemed a distant concern compared to the immediate threat of the mountain. Near midnight, we reached a plateau that would serve as our staging area. From here, we would split into smaller teams and proceed to our assigned positions. My team would set up in a location overlooking a key road junction 2 kilometers behind the Italian front line. As we rested briefly before the final approach, the shadow stood at my shoulder. For the first time, I felt its presence as something more than visual. A cold pressure against my soul, a weight of anticipation. "You know something," I whispered, when the others were occupied with their preparations. "What is it? What's waiting for us?" The shadow's response was not in words, but in sensation. A sudden, overwhelming certainty that death waited ahead. Not just the usual risk of a dangerous mission, but absolute, inescapable doom. I should have said something, warned the others. But what could I say? That a shadow only I could see had given me a premonition? They would think me mad, unfit for duty. So I remained silent as we moved out, the shadow now leading our column like a guide. The Italian machine gun nest was hidden well, positioned to cover a section of the path we had thought would be unguarded. The first burst caught our point man in the chest, killing him instantly. The rest of us dropped for cover, but on the narrow trail there was precious little to be found. "Back!" our sergeant shouted. "Fall back to the plateau!" But retreat meant exposing ourselves to the machine gun's field of fire. We were trapped, pinned down by an enemy who had somehow anticipated our supposedly unthinkable route. The shadow stood in the open, untouched by the bullets that tore through the air. It pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face beside me, a potential route to outflank the machine gun position. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving toward it, sliding into the tight space with my rifle slung across my back. The passage was almost too narrow for a man, the rough stones scraping against my uniform and skin as I forced my way through. Behind me, I could hear the continued firing of the machine gun and the sporadic return fire from our own weapons. The Harrowing crevice opened onto a small ledge about 30 meters from the Italian position. From here, I had a clear line of sight to the gunner and his assistant. I unslung my rifle, setting up for a shot that could save what remained of our patrol. Through the scope, I could see them clearly. 2 men, focused entirely on maintaining their fire on my comrades. Easy targets. The first shot struck the gunner in the temple, killing him instantly. The second caught the assistant as he attempted to take over the gun. Silence fell, broken only by the echoing remnants of the gunshots fading among the peaks. I signaled to the others, indicating that the threat was eliminated. Cautiously, they began to move forward. The shadow stood beside the dead Italians, looking down at them with its featureless face. Then it turned toward me, raising an arm, to point directly at my chest. In that moment, I understood what it had been trying to tell me. The bullet struck me high in the right shoulder, spinning me back against the rock face. A second Italian position, one I had failed to spot, had me in their sights. Pain exploded through my body as I scrambled for cover, my rifle falling from suddenly numb fingers. I heard Weber shout my name, followed by the sound of covering fire as they attempted to reach my position. Blood soaked through my uniform, hot at first, then quickly cooling in the mountain air. The shadow knelt beside me, its formless head tilted as if in contemplation. "Not yet," I gasped, pressing my hand against the wound. "I'm not ready." My vision began to darken at the edges. The last thing I saw clearly was the shadow extending its hand toward me, offering something I wasn't prepared to accept. They tell me I was unconscious for 3 days after they brought me back to the field. Hospital. The bullet had shattered my collarbone and damaged the surrounding tissue, but somehow missed the major blood vessels. I would live, though my days as a sniper were finished. Dr. Hoffman says the shadow is a manifestation of trauma, a physical representation of my mind's attempt to process the horrors I've witnessed and inflicted. He prescribes rest and talks of eventually sending me to a specialized hospital in Munich, where they treat cases like mine. But I know the truth. The shadow wasn't born from my damaged mind. It found me because I had become like it, a harvester of souls, a marker of men for death. It recognized in me a kindred spirit, or perhaps an apprentice. Even now, as I write these words from my hospital bed, it stands in the corner of the ward, watching. Not just me anymore, but all of us. The broken men who have returned from the front. It moves among the beds at night, standing beside those who will not see morning. Sometimes I think I'm the only one who can see it. Other times I catch the eyes of other patients following its movement, their expressions betraying the same knowledge that burns in my heart. We have looked too long into the abyss of death. Now death looks back through us. Oberjäger Matthias Brandt, 24. 2nd Bavarian Jäger Battalion, Alpine Corps. Born in Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. The earth breathes. Most men never notice it, but when you've spent weeks beneath the surface, you learn its rhythms. As I lay pressed against the tunnel wall, listening through my geophone, the distinction between soil and flesh began to blur. My fingertips registered vibrations so faint they might have been my own pulse. Then I heard it, the unmistakable tap-tap scrape of British miners, no more than 3 meters away. They were digging toward our line. Confirm distance, whispered. Unteroffizier Weber, his face ghostly in the dim carbide lamp. I didn't answer immediately. The sounds in my head had become confusing. The British picks, the creaking timbers, the soft murmur of soil shifting around us, and something else. Voices that couldn't possibly be there. "Brandt!" Weber hissed, shaking my shoulder. I blinked, suddenly back in my body. 3 meters, northwest quadrant, moving parallel to Junction 7. Weber nodded grimly. "We set the charges now. They're too close." As I reached for the explosives, the earth exhaled, and the voices grew louder. I was no longer certain if the men I heard were British miners or the ghosts of those we'd already buried in this lightless hell. I never set out to become a tunneler. Before the war, I worked as a mining engineer in the Bavarian Alps, extracting salt and occasionally copper when we found it. The mountains had been my home, the open sky my constant companion. Even the deepest mine shafts in Berchtesgaden had exits you could see from the bottom, pinpricks of light promising eventual escape. Here on the Western Front, there was no such promise. Only earth, endless earth, pressing in from all sides. I joined the Alpine Corps in August 1914, proud to serve in an elite mountain infantry unit. Our training had prepared us for fighting in harsh alpine terrain, scaling cliffs, surviving blizzards, navigating treacherous passes. None of it prepared us for the war that awaited. After the initial advances stalled and the trenches were dug, the war went underground. The High Command recognized that our mining experience made us valuable for a different kind of warfare. Our tunnel company was formed in early 1916, 12 of us from various Jaeger battalions within the Alpine Corps, all with mining experience. Our mission: counter the British tunneling companies that were trying to place massive mines beneath our positions. It began simply enough. We dug listening posts, shallow tunnels extending from our trenches where men with geophones could detect enemy digging. When British activity was confirmed, we would dig counter-tunnels to intercept them, either to fight them directly underground, or more commonly, to place charges and collapse their tunnels. The work was grueling. In shifts of 6 hours, we advanced our tunnels using only hand tools to minimize noise. The main passages were barely a meter high and 70 centimeters wide. The clay and chalk beneath Flanders became our world. We breathed its dust, wore its stains, tasted it in our food. Weber was our section leader, a former silver miner from Saxony with a mathematician's mind for underground navigation. He could estimate distances and directions with uncanny precision, even without instruments. "The earth speaks to those who listen," he often said. I thought it poetic nonsense until I began to hear it myself. My first collapse happened 3 weeks after I joined the tunnelers. We had dug a countermine toward a British tunnel and placed a camouflet, a small mine designed to destroy their shaft without disturbing the surface. The blast was perfectly executed, but we hadn't properly reinforced our own access tunnel. I was returning with Gefreiter Hoffmann when we felt the tremor. He pushed me forward just as the ceiling gave way. I escaped with minor bruises. Hoffmann was buried up to his chest, his legs crushed. It took us 2 hours to dig him out. He died before we reached the surface. That night, I dreamed of Hoffmann whispering from inside the walls of our dugout. When I woke, I could still hear him. This was my first encounter with what the veterans called tunnel sickness. The mine's rebellion against continued existence beneath the earth. Our company commander, Lieutenant Keller, had seen it before. "It will pass," he told me. "The mind adapts or breaks. There is no middle ground down here." By spring 1916, I had adapted. My body grew accustomed to moving through confined spaces, my eyes to seeing in near darkness, my ears to distinguishing between the normal groans of a tunnel and the sounds of enemy activity. I became the company's primary listener, spending hours with my ear pressed against a geophone, tracking British movements through vibrations in the soil. It was during these listening sessions that I first noticed the pattern. When I concentrated deeply enough, the random noises of the earth resolved into something like speech, indistinct, but unmistakably communicative. I mentioned it once to Keller, who studied me with concern. "How long since you've been above?" "Ground, Brant." I had to think about it. 11 days, Herr Leutnant. Take 24 hours. Get some sunlight." I didn't argue. The next day, I sat in a meadow behind our reserve lines, watching clouds and convincing myself that what I'd heard was nothing more than the product of fatigue and isolation. When I returned to the tunnels, the voices were still there. By June 1916, the underground war had intensified. Intelligence reported that the British were planning a major offensive, preceded by a series of mine detonations along our front. Our work took on new urgency. Weber, myself, and 4 others were assigned to a new listening post near Vichita, where unusual activity had been detected. We extended a narrow shaft from our forward trench, digging day and night in rotating shifts. After a week, we had a network of small tunnels running 20 meters deep and extending up to 40 meters toward the British lines. It was in the furthest listening post that I first encountered them directly, the whisperers in the walls. I was alone, monitoring a geophone, when the faint sounds of British digging suddenly ceased. In the silence that followed, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "They come with fire. Fire in the earth." Flesh and metal fused in flame. I removed the geophone, certain I was imagining things. The whispers continued. 27 meters. Northwest. They plant death. I checked my map. 27 meters northwest would place the British directly under a crucial junction in our defensive line. A perfect location for a mine. Despite my better judgment, I marked the position and reported it to Weber. He was skeptical until our instruments confirmed unusual activity exactly where I'd indicated. We dispatched a countermining team immediately and intercepted a British tunnel containing 8,000 kilograms of explosives. After this success, I began to rely more on the whispers. They never misled me, though their messages grew increasingly strange. The earth remembers every body laid within it. Time moves differently here. Yesterday's dead still scream tomorrow. You belong with us now, Matthias Brandt. Your blood is clay. I told no one about these communications. To admit hearing voices would mean instant removal from the tunneling company, possibly confinement to a field hospital for the mentally broken. Instead, I translated their guidance into plausible deductions based on listening data. By late 1916, I had helped locate and neutralize 7 British mining operations. Lieutenant Keller recommended me for promotion and an Iron Cross second class. The medal ceremony was held above ground, in daylight. I felt like a visitor from another world. That night, returning to our underground barracks, I passed a newly dug section and froze. From behind the shoring timbers came a sound like fingernails scraping earth. I placed my hand against the wall and felt it, warm, pulsing, like a great beast breathing. Sie sind wach, I whispered. They are awake. The wall trembled under my palm, as if in acknowledgement. The Messines offensive began on June 7th, 1917. Despite our efforts, the British succeeded in placing 19 enormous mines under our lines. The simultaneous detonation was the largest man-made explosion in history to that point. Audible even in London, they later said. I was 30 meters underground when it happened. Our tunnel network collapsed around us. Support beams shattered like matchsticks. Men were crushed or suffocated within seconds. I survived in a small pocket formed by fallen timbers. For 3 days, I lay in complete darkness, the air growing thinner, my consciousness fading in and out. It was then that the voices became my only companions. You see now, Matthias, this is what men do. They tear open the earth and pour in their hatred. We were men once too. Now we are soil and memory. Join us. There is peace in dissolution. I felt myself slipping, my identity dissolving into the surrounding earth. It would have been easy to surrender, to become one with the voices. Instead, I began to dig, clawing at the debris with bleeding fingers. Something beyond my understanding drove me upward, toward a surface I could neither see nor truly remember. Ennui. The third day, I broke through into a partially intact section of tunnel. Half delirious, I followed it until I encountered a German rescue team searching for survivors. Of the 17 men in our company, only 3 of us emerged alive. The medical officers diagnosed me with severe shell shock and carbon dioxide poisoning. They spoke of hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation. I accepted their explanations without argument. What purpose would the truth serve? After 2 weeks in a field hospital, I was deemed fit to return to duty. The tunneling companies had been decimated, however, and the High Command had decided to reduce underground operations. I was reassigned to my original Jaeger battalion in the Alpine Corps. Back above ground, serving in a traditional infantry role, I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I startled at open spaces. The sky seemed an oppressive void, infinite and threatening. At night, I dug shallow holes to sleep in, needing the pressure of earth around me. The voices followed me. Fainter now, but present, especially when I pressed my ear to the ground during artillery barrages. They spoke of movements beneath. Our position, of British tunnels we'd never discovered, of mines waiting to erupt. My commanding officer noted my strange behavior, but attributed it to the common symptoms of shell shock. Men who stared at nothing, who jumped at shadows, who spoke to themselves. The Western Front was full of such cases. As long as I performed my duties, my peculiarities were tolerated. In October 1917, we were transferred to the Italian front for the Battle of Caporetto. The mountain fighting should have felt natural to an Alpine Corps soldier. For me, it was torment. The peaks and valleys, the open slopes. All of it emphasized my disconnection from the Earth's embrace. I volunteered for every dugout construction detail, every shelter digging assignment. My comrades thought me exceptionally dedicated. They didn't understand that I was seeking communion with what lived below. Near Caporetto, we captured an Italian position built into a mountainside. Deep inside the complex, I found a natural cave extending beyond the fortifications. While the rest of my unit secured the position, I slipped into the darkness of the cave. The temperature dropped as I proceeded deeper. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the familiar whispers, stronger here than I'd ever heard them. The mountains are old, Matthias. They remember when all was fire and stone. Your war is a blink to them. But the dead you create, they join us forever. I reached a chamber where water had carved smooth bowls into the limestone. Sitting there in perfect darkness, I finally asked the question that had haunted me since Messines. What are you? The answer came not in words, but in visions. I saw millennia of bodies returning to the soil. Neanderthals, ancient tribes, Romans, medieval peasants, and now millions of young men in field gray and khaki, all dissolving, their essence absorbed into the earth, their consciousness persisting in some unfathomable way. I saw the planet as a living entity, indifferent to our conflicts yet absorbing their consequences. The minerals of our bones, the carbon of our flesh, the iron of our blood, all reclaimed by the earth that produced them, and I understood that I had been changed irrevocably. The tunnel collapse had killed something in me, the boundary that separated my consciousness from the greater awareness that resided in the soil. I'm not certain how long I remained in that cave. When I emerged, the battle had moved on. I rejoined my unit, resumed my duties, fought until the armistice. But I was never fully present in the world of men again. After the war, I could not return to Berchtesgaden. The mountains held no solace for me now. Instead, I found work in the coal mines of the Ruhr. My comrades there noticed my uncanny ability to predict cave-ins, to locate new seams, to navigate underground without maps. They don't hear what I hear. They don't understand that the earth preserves what it consumes. That beneath our feet lies not just rock and soil, but memory and consciousness. At night, I sleep with my ear pressed to the ground, listening to the whispers of those who came before. They speak of ancient wars forgotten by history, of civilizations buried by time, of future conflicts that will feed the earth with new voices, and they speak of me, Matthias Brandt, who is neither fully alive nor dead, but something in between, a translator between worlds. The doctors call it shell shock. I know better. It is communion. Unteroffizier Werner Keller, 24 years old, 5th Assault Company, Sturmtruppen, born in Cologne, Rhine Province. The earth whispered. That's what drove men mad down here. Not the darkness or the crushing weight above, but the whispers. I pressed my ear against the cold clay wall, straining to hear past my own heartbeat. The British sappers were there, just beyond, slowly carving their way toward us with every scrape of their entrenching tools. They weren't digging a simple trench. They were hollowing out hell beneath us. A void they would fill with enough explosives to turn our position into a crater. I looked at Müller, his face ghostly in the dim light of our carbide lamp. They're getting closer, I whispered. Maybe 10 meters now. Müller's eyes widened. the whites visible all around his irises like a frightened horse. "We need to find their tunnel entrance, now." Our breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. 6 of us had been sent beneath no man's land. Sturmtruppen selected for our ability to fight in confined spaces, to locate and eliminate the British mining operation. We were tunnel hunters now, playing a deadly game of blind man's bluff 20 meters below ground. The difference was simple: whoever found the other first would live. The others would be buried in a communion of soil and flesh that would last until Judgment Day. I flicked off the safety on my shortened Car 98, the metal click echoing in our narrow passage. Above us, artillery began to fall. German barrage targeting the British lines. The dull thunder reverberated through the earth, sending small cascades of dirt onto our shoulders. In that moment, as the world trembled, I heard something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Not random debris, but a code. The British weren't just close. They were already here. I was not always a man who lived in darkness. Before the war, I worked in my father's printing shop in Cologne, setting type and operating the press. My hands were stained with ink instead of chalk and soil, my lungs filled with the sharp scent of chemicals rather than the damp fungal breath of the earth. When I joined the army in late 1915, I was initially assigned to a regular infantry regiment. 6 months of trench warfare taught me 2 lessons: how to kill and how to survive. Both skills caught the attention of my commanders. When volunteers were requested for the newly formed Sturmtruppen, assault troops trained to infiltrate enemy positions, I stepped forward. Our training was brutal but effective. We learned to move in small, independent groups, to use grenades and flamethrowers, to fight in confined spaces. We became weapons ourselves. Human blades meant to pierce the line where it was weakest. The trenches became our home, the shell holes our shelter. But nothing prepared me for the tunnels. The Western Front had become a stalemate, a 1,000-kilometer scar stretching from the Channel to Switzerland. When armies cannot go around, they go over or under. The British had become masters of the latter, employing coal miners from Wales and northern England to drive tunnels beneath our positions. They packed these passageways with tons of explosives, enough to create artificial volcanoes that could swallow entire companies in an instant. Our orders came on June 1st, 1917. British mining activity had been detected near Messines Ridge, a critical defensive position in Flanders. Intelligence suggested they were planning something massive. My assault group was tasked with a counter-mining operation. Locate the British tunnels, place our own explosives, and collapse their work before they could complete it. We moved at night, using the cover of darkness to approach our own front lines. The jumping-off point was a communication trench that had been deepened and reinforced with timber supports. A narrow shaft descended vertically for 10 meters before leveling out into a horizontal tunnel. Hauptmann Berger briefed us at 2200 hours, his voice low despite our distance from the enemy. "You have all been selected for your experience in close-quarter combat and your psychological stability," he said, though I noticed he avoided looking directly at any of us as he spoke. "This mission is of the highest importance. We believe the British are planning a major mining attack along this sector, possibly within the next week." He unfolded a map on a small field table, weighing the corners down with stones. "Our engineers have established this counter-tunnel," he traced a line with his finger, "but reconnaissance suggests at least 3 British tunnels in this sector. Your job is to locate them, place demolition charges at these junctures," he indicated several points, "and return before detonation at 0500 hours. He rolled up the map and looked at each of us in turn. "Unteroffizier Keller will lead. Questions?" There were none. What was there to ask? We all understood the mission, and we all understood the risks. The silence that followed was filled only with the distant crump of artillery and the soft rustling of equipment being checked one final time. We descended at midnight, The shaft was barely wide enough for a man to pass through, necessitating a climb down rather than a proper descent. The rungs of the ladder were slick with condensation, forcing a white-knuckled grip with each downward step. The air grew, noticeably cooler and damper as we descended, carrying the musty scent of disturbed earth. At the bottom, we assembled in a small chamber hewn from the clay. The space was reinforced with timber supports that creaked ominously with every distant shell impact. Our engineer, Schmidt, spread his equipment on a small folding table. A theodolite for measuring angles, a level, several measuring tapes, and a set of detailed charts showing the estimated positions of British tunneling activity. Based on seismic monitoring, he explained, adjusting a lamp to better illuminate his charts, we believe their main tunnel runs approximately east to west, roughly parallel to our front line, and about 20 meters below ground. They'll need to branch north to place charges beneath our positions. Müller, always the pessimist, spat on the ground. And if your calculations are wrong, Schmidt's face hardened, then we'll either miss them entirely or stumble right into them. I checked my equipment one final time. A shortened Kar 98 rifle with bayonet, a Reichs revolver, 3 egg grenades, a trench knife, a folding entrenching tool, and a gas mask. The others were similarly armed, with the addition of 2 MP-18 submachine guns among the team. We also carried explosive charges, rectangular blocks of picric acid with mechanical timers. Enough to collapse a significant section of tunnel. We moved out at 0030 hours, advancing along our established tunnel before branching into a narrower passage that had been dug specifically for this operation. The ceiling was low, enough that we had to crouch and in some places crawl. Our progress was necessarily slow and deliberate. Sound travels through earth, and the enemy would be listening just as we were. The tunnel forked after about 100 meters. According to Schmidt's calculations, the left branch would intercept the assumed path of the British digging, while the right would take us to a position better suited for setting charges. I split our team. Müller, Klein, and I would take the left fork. Schmidt, Wagner, and Hoffmann would take the right. We synchronized watches and agreed to rendezvous back at this junction in 2 hours. Our passage narrowed further as we advanced, forcing us into single file. I led with Klein in the middle carrying our lamp, and Müller bringing up the rear. The light cast grotesque, elongated shadows that danced with our movement, creating the unsettling impression that we were being followed by misshapen specters. We had advanced perhaps 50 meters when I called for a halt. Extinguishing our lamp, we sat in complete darkness, allowing our ears to become more sensitive. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing and the distant muffled percussion of artillery above. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic scraping, the unmistakable sound of digging. I leaned close to Klein's ear. They're ahead, maybe 15 meters. We need to get closer to pinpoint their location. We advanced with extreme caution, testing each step before committing our weight, moving so slowly that it felt like we were barely advancing at all. The sounds grew gradually more distinct, the clink of metal on stone, the soft huff of exertion, the creak of timber. They were close, much closer than Schmidt had estimated. That's when Klein's foot disturbed a small pile of loose soil, sending a cascade of pebbles clattering down the passage. The sounds ahead ceased instantly. We froze, scarcely daring to breathe. For what felt like an eternity, the tunnel was silent save for the hammering of my heart. Then came a new sound, not digging, but a soft, deliberate tapping. A message, being transmitted through the earth itself. They knew we were here. The next moment, a different sound reached us, the distinctive click of a detonator being primed. "Back!" I hissed, shoving Klein behind me. "Move! Now!" We scrambled backward, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Behind us came the muffled thump of an explosion, followed by the terrifying groan of earth shifting. The tunnel ahead collapsed, a wave of dust billowing toward us as the shock waves slammed into our bodies. But they had miscalculated. Their charge had been too small, intended to kill us directly rather than cause a major collapse. They had revealed their position without successfully eliminating us. Once the dust settled, I assessed our situation. Our forward progress was blocked, but we were unharmed. More importantly, we now knew precisely where one of their tunnels was located. "We need to circle around," I whispered. "Link up with Schmidt's team and approach from the other direction." We backtracked to the junction, finding it deserted. Schmidt's team had not returned. I checked my watch. We still had 40 minutes before our rendezvous time. "We follow the right fork," I decided. "Find Schmidt and warn him." The right passage showed signs of recent movement. Footprints in the soft earth, a discarded cigarette butt, a smear of oil where someone had rested a lamp. We followed, these signs moving as quickly as caution allowed. The tunnel began to slope downward, taking us deeper beneath no man's land. The air grew noticeably more stale, and the pressure in my ears increased. We were well below 20 meters now, perhaps approaching 30. The timber supports were placed closer together here, the earth between them bulging ominously under the immense weight above. After approximately 200 meters, the tunnel abruptly ended in a rough clay wall. There was no sign of Schmidt's team. "They must have found a side passage we've missed," Müller suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. I studied the end of the tunnel carefully, running my fingers along the wall. The clay was softer here, disturbed. I pressed my ear against it and listened. That's when I heard the whispers. We had been underground for 4 hours now. My watch showed 0415 hours, less than an hour until our planned detonation time. After discovering the soft wall, we had carefully excavated a small opening, revealing a natural seam in the clay that Schmidt's team must have followed. The passage was extremely narrow, requiring us to remove our equipment and push it ahead of us as we squirmed through on our bellies like worms. The seam opened into what was clearly a British tunnel, wider, higher, and reinforced with metal arches rather than timber. Electric lights strung along the ceiling cast a harsh glare that momentarily blinded us after hours in the dim glow of our carbide lamps. Most disturbing was the silence. No digging, no movement, no voices. The tunnel appeared deserted. "They've pulled back," Müller whispered. "They're preparing to detonate." I nodded, coming to the same conclusion. "We need to find Schmidt's team and place our charges." We advanced cautiously down the British tunnel, weapons ready. At a junction, we discovered fresh blood smeared across the wall and floor. A firefight had occurred here recently. Following the blood trail, we found Wagner's body slumped in a side passage, his throat cut, eyes still open in permanent surprise. "Ambush," Klein muttered, crossing himself. They were waiting. Further down the passage, we discovered the bodies of Schmidt and Hoffmann. They had died fighting back to back, surrounded by spent cartridges and the bodies of 2 British sappers. But there was no sign of the British demolition charges, the main objective of our mission. "The main chamber must be further in," I said, checking my watch again. "We have 30 minutes. We followed the tunnel as it curved gradually to the left, sloping even deeper underground. The air grew noticeably warmer, an indication we were approaching a larger chamber where more men had been working. The electric lights ended, plunging us back into the limited circle of illumination provided by our lamp. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that stole the breath from my lungs. The British had excavated a space large, enough to hold a small house, shoring it up with an elaborate system of timber frames and metal supports. At the center of this chamber stood the reason for all this effort, a massive stockpile of explosives in wooden crates, carefully arranged and wired to multiple detonators. This wasn't just another mine. This was something unprecedented. Enough explosives to obliterate everything above for hundreds of meters. "My God," Müller whispered. "There must be 50 tons here." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something else. The chamber was not deserted. In the far corner, 3 British sappers were huddled around a table, examining what appeared to be a timing mechanism. They hadn't noticed us yet. I signaled to Müller and Klein, indicating that they should place our charges near the main. Stockpile while I covered the British soldiers. Drawing my Reich's revolver, I stepped into the chamber. Hands up, I called in English. Don't move. The British sappers froze, then slowly raised their hands. One of them, a grizzled sergeant, with coal dust permanently ingrained in the lines of his face, spoke in a calm voice. You're too late, Fritz. This whole system is set to blow in 20 minutes. Dead man switches. You kill us, it goes early. I kept my revolver steady. Then you'll disarm it. The sergeant laughed, a hollow sound in the cavernous space. No chance of that. This mine has been 2 years in the making. 19 mines along this ridge, all set to blow together. It's going to be the biggest bang in history. Behind me, Klein hissed. He's stalling. We need to place our charges and get out. I nodded without taking my eyes off the British sappers. Do it. 5 minutes, then we leave, with or without them. Müller and Klein moved toward the explosive stockpile, their movements betraying their nervousness. The sergeant watched them with an unsettling smile. You won't make it out, he said conversationally. None of us will. The whole ridge is going to disappear. I kept my revolver trained on him, trying to ignore the cold sweat trickling down my spine. Why are you still here then? His smile widened, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Someone had to stay to make sure it happens. Draw the short straws, we did. Suicide troops, men left behind to ensure the mission's success, even at the cost of their own lives. I felt a reluctant flicker of respect. Müller called out, Charges set. 10-minute timer. Go, I ordered, backing toward the tunnel entrance. I'm right behind you. The sergeant's eyes met mine, an understanding passing between us. Soldier to soldier. Better run fast, Fritz, he said softly. I backed into the tunnel, then turned and sprinted after my comrades. Behind us, the British sappers made no move to follow. They had their orders, just as we had ours. We ran through the tunnels, abandoning all caution now. Our lamp swung wildly, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to leap at us from every direction. At one junction, Klein hesitated, unsure of the way. Precious seconds ticked by as we debated the correct path. We found the shaft at 4:48, with 7 minutes remaining before our charges would detonate. The climb up seemed endless, each rung of the ladder requiring a supreme effort from exhausted muscles. Above us, the sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn glow. We emerged into a world transformed. A massive artillery barrage. Ours. Or theirs, it was impossible to tell, had churned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and shattered timber. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. I checked my watch. 4:52. 3 minutes remaining. Run! I shouted, pushing Klein and Müller toward our lines. Don't stop! We sprinted across no man's land, expecting, at any moment, to be cut down by machine gun fire. But the barrage had driven both sides to cover, and we encountered no resistance. We reached our front-line trench with less than a minute to spare, sliding down into the relative safety of the reinforced position. Hauptmann Berger was waiting, his face a mask of tension. Report! Between gasping breaths, I explained what we had found. The massive mining operation, the 19 charges set to detonate simultaneously, the imminent destruction of the entire ridge. Berger's face drained of color. He grabbed his field telephone and began shouting orders for an immediate evacuation of the forward positions. At precisely 4:55, our charges detonated. The earth shuddered beneath our feet, but this was merely the prelude. Seconds later, a much larger tremor began, a deep, primal shaking that seemed to rise from the very core of the earth. And then, the world exploded. The Messines mines detonated in a chain reaction that was heard as far away as London. 19 enormous explosions in quick succession. throwing nearly 1 million tons of earth and everything on it into the air. The ridge that had been our home for months simply ceased to exist, replaced by a line of craters large enough to swallow cathedrals. 10,000 German soldiers died in those few seconds. I survived only because of what we had discovered. Our warning had allowed a partial evacuation of the immediate area. But as I watched the earth ripple like water from the force of the explosions, I knew that the men I had met below, the British sappers who had stayed behind, were now part of the ridge forever, entombed in the culmination of their 2 years' work. In the silence that followed the explosions, as debris continued to rain down and the sky itself seemed to darken with suspended earth, I found myself thinking of those tunnels, the narrow passages where men had fought and died in darkness, the whispers in the walls, the cold calculation of tonnage required to move mountains. The British attack began at dawn, advancing behind a rolling barrage to claim what remained of Messines Ridge. We retreated, having lost not just the ground but also the certainty that had sustained us, the belief that the earth itself was solid and unchanging. I never entered a tunnel again. Even now, years later, I wake from dreams where the earth whispers to me, where walls of clay pulse with the heartbeats of men entombed within them, where darkness swallows everything except the sound of my own breathing. In this war, we have learned to fight not just across the surface of the earth, but within it. We have turned the very ground beneath our feet into a weapon, and in doing so, we have surrendered our claim to be its masters. The earth remembers, and one day, it will swallow us all. Corporal Duncan McPherson, 27, 51st Highland Division, 252nd Tunnelling Company, Royal Engineers, born in Inverness, Scotland. The earth groaned above us, not the gentle shifting of soil, but the violent percussion of artillery that seemed determined to bury us alive. 6 feet of packed clay and chalk separated us from annihilation, and in the flickering light of our candles, I could see the fear etched on every man's face. Sweat-soaked and filthy. We huddled in our narrow tunnel as loose dirt sprinkled down with each detonation. "She's holding," whispered Lieutenant Ross, his voice barely audible over the muffled thunder above. "Keep working." The pick in my hands felt like it weighed 50 pounds as I swung it into the face of the tunnel, each impact sending shockwaves up my arms. My lungs burned from the stale air, thick with moisture and the smell of unwashed bodies. Behind me, Private Mackay worked the hand drill, making holes for our explosives that would extend our deadly reach beneath the German lines. Then we heard it, the faint tapping sound that froze the blood in our veins. "Fritz is digging," hissed Sergeant Campbell, "and he's close." We doused our candles immediately, plunging ourselves into absolute darkness. In that moment, I felt the true terror of the war beneath the war. The silent battle fought not with bullets and bayonets, but with shovels and explosives in the suffocating darkness below no man's land. I arrived at the front in April 1916, transferred from the Gordon Highlanders to the newly formed tunneling companies after they discovered I'd been a coal miner before the war. The Western Front had evolved into a subterranean nightmare, with both sides desperately trying to undermine each other's positions, literally. Our section of the 252nd Tunnelling Company was attached to the 51st Highland Division near Arras, where the chalky soil was perfect for tunneling operations. It was a peculiar calling, this underground war. Above, men fought for inches of blood-soaked earth. Below, we crept forward yard by yard, silent as ghosts, each of us knowing that at any moment the enemy might break through, or worse, detonate explosives that would entomb us forever. My first day underground nearly broke me. The tunnel entrance was hidden in a communications trench, a simple wooden doorframe leading into the mouth of hell. Lieutenant Ross, a former mining engineer from Glasgow, led me down a series of rough-hewn steps that descended about 30 feet into the earth. "Watch your head, McPherson," he warned as I ducked under the low timber supports. "And keep your voice down. Sound travels through the earth, and Fritz has good ears." The main gallery was barely 5 feet high, forcing most of us to stoop as we moved through. Wooden frames supported the walls and ceiling every few feet, and duckboards lined the floor to keep us out of the seeping groundwater. Oil lamps hung at intervals, casting long shadows that danced like demons across the rough walls. "You'll be working with Campbell's section," Ross explained, leading me deeper into the labyrinth. "They're extending Gallery 4 toward the German lines. We believe the enemy is mining in the same area." As we rounded a corner, I encountered the men who would become my brothers in this strange underground war. 5 filthy, exhausted soldiers sat on ammunition boxes, drinking tea from tin cups. They looked up as we approached, their faces pale and ghostly in the dim light. "New blood, lads," Ross announced. "Corporal McPherson here is from the Gordon Highlanders. Was a coal miner before the war." Sergeant Campbell, a burly man with a thick red beard, stood and extended a hand covered in chalk dust and blisters. "Welcome to the moles, Corporal. Hope you're not afraid of the dark." That first night underground taught me everything about this new kind of warfare. Campbell's section worked in 8-hour shifts, rotating with 2 other teams to maintain round-the-clock progress. Our goal was to extend our tunnel beneath a German strongpoint approximately 80 yards away, place 5,000 pounds of aminal explosives, and blow it to Kingdom Come. But the Germans had the same idea. "Listen," Campbell instructed, pressing his ear against the tunnel face. We all fell silent, the only sound our labored breathing in the close confines. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, almost like the ticking of a distant clock. "That's Fritz," Campbell whispered. "Sounds like they're about 40 yards away, coming in at a slight angle to our line." "How can you tell?" I asked. "Experience," he replied grimly. "And this?" He produced a geophone, a listening device with 2 earpieces connected to sensitive microphones. "We take readings every hour, plot their progress. It's a race now. Either we reach our target first, or we intercept them. If they get too close, we'll have to blow a camouflage to collapse their tunnel." The other men in the section introduced themselves. Private Mackay, a wiry Glaswegian with quick hands and a quicker wit. Corporal Sutherland, a former gold miner from Aberdeen with an uncanny sense of direction underground. Private Murray, barely 19 and already developing the 1,000-yard stare. And Private Fraser, a taciturn Highlander who spoke more Gaelic than English. "We're like badgers down here," Mackay joked, offering me a cigarette. "Digging and fighting and never seeing the sun." "Don't light that yet," Campbell warned. "We need to check for gas first." He held up a safety lamp and watched the flame carefully. "All clear," he announced after a moment. "But keep it brief. Every bit of oxygen is precious down here." We worked in pairs, one man excavating while the other removed the spoil in sandbags that were passed back along a human chain to be dispersed at night when the Germans couldn't see the fresh earth being added to our parapets. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Every foot gained required careful shoring with timber supports, and the constant threat of water seepage meant we sometimes worked ankle-deep in muddy water. But the real danger was what we couldn't see. The enemy tunnelers working toward us, or above us, or below us. The war in the darkness was a nerve-wracking game of blind man's bluff played with high explosives. After 3 weeks underground, I'd lost track of time completely. Day and night meant nothing in our eternal twilight. We measured time in shifts and feet of progress. We'd advanced about 60 yards toward our target, carefully plotting our course with surveying equipment to ensure we ended up directly beneath the German position. It was during one of these measuring sessions that we heard the Germans getting closer. "They're changing direction," Sutherland whispered. The geophone pressed to his ears. "Coming directly toward us now. Couldn't be more than 20 yards away." Lieutenant Ross was summoned from his dugout near the tunnel entrance. After listening for himself, he made a quick decision. "We'll dig a defensive chamber," he ordered. "Here, perpendicular to our main drive. Small camouflage charge to collapse. Their tunnel when they get close enough." For the next 18 hours, we worked in near silence, carving out a small chamber just big enough for 500 pounds of explosives. The sounds of German digging grew steadily louder, until we could occasionally hear muffled voices. "They're getting sloppy," Campbell muttered as we carefully positioned the charges. "Talking too loud, overconfident." Ross calculated they would reach our position in approximately 12 hours. We packed the chamber with explosives, ran the electrical detonation wires back down our tunnel, and sealed the chamber with sandbags and timber. "Everyone out," Ross ordered once the preparations were complete. "I want the entire section back at the second gallery junction." We retreated several hundred feet and waited. Ross stayed behind with the detonator, listening with the geophone for the perfect moment. An hour passed, then another. The tension was unbearable. Finally, Ross appeared at the junction, his face grim with concentration. "They're directly adjacent to our charge now." I could hear them talking clearly. He connected the wires to the exploder and nodded to Campbell. "Care to do the honors, Sergeant?" Campbell gripped the handle of the exploder. "For the lads we lost at Givenchy," he said quietly, then pushed down on the plunger. The earth shuddered around us. A distant thump reverberated through the tunnel, followed by a rush of air that extinguished several of our lamps. Fine dust filled the gallery, coating our already filthy uniforms with a fresh layer of chalk. "That settled their hash," Mackay grinned in the semi-darkness. But our victory was short-lived. 2 days later, our listening posts detected new German activity. Not one tunnel now, but two, approaching from different angles. They're determined to get under our lines, Ross explained during our briefing. "Command believes they're planning a major mine attack to support their next offensive. We need to locate and destroy both tunnels." What followed was the most intense period of the underground war I would experience. We extended listening posts in 3 directions, worked around the clock in shorter shifts to maintain alertness, and prepared defensive chambers at strategic points. Sleep became a luxury none of us could afford. The strain began to tell. Murray developed a nervous tic in his left eye. Fraser became even more withdrawn, muttering to himself in Gaelic as he worked. Even Campbell's ironclad composure showed cracks when a timber support collapsed, nearly crushing Sutherland. Yet somehow, in those inhuman conditions, our bond grew stronger than any I'd known, even in my infantry days above ground. Perhaps it was the shared peril, or the intimate confines that forced us to know each other's habits and rhythms. We could communicate almost without speaking. A grunt, a gesture, a look conveying complex messages. We learned each other's stories. Campbell had been a mine foreman in Fife, with 3 daughters he hadn't seen in 18 months. Mackay was engaged to a nurse serving at a casualty clearing station just 10 miles behind our lines. But they hadn't managed to coordinate leave to meet. Sutherland carried his wife's handkerchief, stained with perfume long since faded. Murray had lied about his age to enlist, running from a father who beat him. Fraser had been a gamekeeper on a Highland estate, more comfortable with animals than people, and they learned about me, my childhood in Inverness, my years in the coal mines. My younger brother killed at Ypres in 1915. One night, as we sat in a small rest chamber brewing tea on a contraband spirit lamp, Mackay looked around at our filthy, exhausted faces and started to laugh. "What's so bloody funny?" Campbell growled. "Just thinking," Mackay replied. "The Huns above ground would piss themselves if they could see the state of the warriors coming to blow them to hell. We looked like coal-dusted scarecrows. It wasn't that funny, but we all dissolved into near hysterical laughter. Months of tension finding release in that moment of shared absurdity. Even Fraser cracked a smile. Brothers of the dark, Sutherland said when we'd finally collected ourselves. That's what we are now. Aye? Campbell nodded, and brothers watch each other's backs. 3 days later, we located the first of the new German tunnels. Using the tactics we'd employed before, we set a camouflage charge and collapsed it. The second proved more elusive, changing direction several times as if they suspected our presence. It was Fraser who finally pinpointed it, his keen ears detecting the faint sounds of digging through nearly 30 feet of chalk and clay. We prepared another defensive chamber. But as we worked, the German digging suddenly accelerated. They've heard us, Ross realized. They're making a push to break through before we can set our charges. What followed was a desperate race. We abandoned caution, digging frantically toward the approaching Germans. The risk of cave-in increased with every foot we advanced, without proper shoring, but we had no choice. Suddenly, Murray's pick broke through into empty space. "I'm through," he hissed. Campbell yanked him back just as a German stick grenade came flying through the small hole, bouncing along our tunnel floor. Mackay reacted instantly, kicking it back through the opening before throwing himself down. The explosion collapsed part of our tunnel and sealed the breach. "Everyone back," Ross ordered. "We're going to have to blow what we've got." We retreated to a safe distance and detonated our partially completed camouflage. The explosion was massive, larger than we'd calculated. And for a terrifying moment, I thought our entire tunnel system would collapse. When the dust settled, Ross sent Sutherland and me forward to assess the damage. What we found was sobering. Our gallery had partially collapsed, but through a fissure in the rubble, we could see the remnants of the German tunnel. Inside were the bodies of at least 4 enemy tunnelers, buried by our explosive. "Poor bastards," Sutherland murmured. "Same as us, just digging the other way." That night, back in our dugout behind the front lines, we drank our rum ration, in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. We'd won the underground battle, at least for now, but the victory felt hollow somehow. Campbell finally raised his tin cup. "To the dark," he said simply. "To the dark," we echoed. "And to the light, we'll see again someday." 3 weeks later, the 51st Highland Division would join the massive assault at Arras, advancing over the very ground we'd undermined. Many of our friends above ground wouldn't survive that push, but in our tunnels, in that strange war beneath the war, our section came through intact, bound by the unbreakable camaraderie forged in the dark, suffocating confines beneath no man's land. Lieutenant James McCallum, 23 years old, 51st Highland Division Artillery Observer, born in Aberdeen, Scotland. The observation balloon swayed violently in the wind. The wicker basket creaked under my feet with every gust-off wind. 1,000 feet below, the battlefield of Passchendaele stretched out like an obscene painting. Mud, shell holes, and death as far as the eye could see. I gripped my field glasses with white knuckles, trying to steady them against the constant motion. "Fokker, coming in fast, 3 o'clock, Sergeant Willis shouted beside me. I swung my eye, gazed to the right, just in time to see the German aircraft emerging from a cloud bank, its distinctive red fuselage gleaming in the afternoon sun. The pilot had spotted us, a perfect target, suspended helplessly in the sky. He banked sharply, diving toward our position. "Signal the ground crew, now!" I shouted, but Willis was already frantically working the telephone. A shower of tracer rounds arced up from our defensive positions, falling short of the attacking aircraft. The Fokker's machine gun opened fire, the distinctive hammering sound reaching us a split second before bullets ripped through the balloon's fabric above our heads. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to die, suspended in a flimsy basket hundreds of feet above the earth. The parachute strapped to my back suddenly felt inadequate. A cruel joke. Air hissed from the punctures in the balloon envelope. We were losing altitude, but not quickly enough to escape the German fighter circling back for another attack run. "We have to jump, sir," Willis screamed, but my legs had turned to stone. The Fokker was coming straight at us now, its machine gun spitting death. 3 weeks earlier, I had been a junior artillery officer, directing batteries from the relative safety of a command post. My transfer to balloon observation had come unexpectedly. Major Guthrie had called me to his dugout after evening stand-to. "McCallum, you studied mathematics at university, correct?" he asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Yes, sir, before the war." "Good. You're being transferred to Balloon Section 6. They need officers who can calculate trajectories quickly." He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Report to Captain Hendry at 0600 tomorrow." I stood frozen. Balloon observers were notorious for their short lifespans. Suspended high above the battlefield in hydrogen-filled death traps, they were priority targets for enemy aircraft and artillery. "Sir, That's all, Lieutenant." His tone left no room for discussion. My first ascent came after just 3 days of training. Barely enough time to learn the basics of artillery, spotting, and the use of the parachute. The observer I was replacing, Lieutenant Ross, had been shot down the previous week. He'd managed to bail out before his balloon caught fire, but broke both legs upon landing. He was considered lucky. The 51st Highland Division had been positioned near Ypres for the upcoming offensive. The terrain was a nightmare, flat, muddy, and offering little natural cover. Our artillery would be crucial in breaking through the German defenses, and accurate observation was essential. Captain Hendry briefed me the night before my first mission. "You'll be working with Sergeant Willis. He's experienced. Listen to him." He paused, lighting a cigarette. "If you spot a German aircraft approaching, don't hesitate. Jump. The balloon is expendable. You are not, at least not entirely." He smiled grimly. "What about our own aircraft protection, sir? RAF patrols will be in the area, but don't count on them being there when you need them." He exhaled a plume of smoke. "The Germans know exactly what we're planning. They'll be hunting our observation platforms aggressively." I barely slept that night, my mind filled with images of burning balloons and men falling through the sky, their parachutes failing to open. My first week as an observer passed without incident. Willis and I developed a routine, ascending at dawn to spot German activity and direct our artillery fire. The view from 1,000 feet was simultaneously breathtaking and horrifying. The entire battlefield laid out like a map, yet each distant explosion represented real men being torn apart. "You're getting good at this, sir," Willis commented on our 6th day, as I successfully directed a barrage onto a German ammunition dump. The resulting secondary explosions were visible, even without field glasses. "It's mathematics, Sergeant. Distance, wind speed, angle of descent." Willis shook his head. "It's more than that. It's instinct. You either have it or you don't." I didn't tell him about the nightmares that had begun, dreams where I was falling endlessly, my parachute a useless bundle of silk above me. Or worse, dreams where I was burning alive, trapped in the balloon basket as flames consumed everything around me. The paranoia grew gradually. At first, it was merely heightened vigilance, carefully scanning the skies for enemy aircraft while carrying out my observation duties. Then it became constant tension, jumping at every distant speck in the clouds. By the end of the second week, I was seeing phantom aircraft everywhere, mistaking birds and smoke for approaching Fokkers. "You need to settle your nerves, sir," Willis advised after I had mistakenly called for an emergency descent. "Most observers last an average of 3 weeks before getting shot down. You're halfway there. Don't crack now." His attempt at reassurance only intensified my fears. The artillery preparations for the Passchendaele offensive began in earnest on July 22, 1917. Hundreds of guns fired continuously, attempting to destroy the German defenses before our infantry attacked. Our role was crucial, identifying targets and correcting fire. On July 26th, during a routine observation mission, we spotted unusual activity behind the German lines. "Sir, look there." Willis pointed to an area about 2 miles behind the front. "They're moving something large under those camouflage nets." I trained my field glasses on the area. "Heavy artillery. They're repositioning their guns." "Should we call it in?" "Yes. Map reference K47. I continued observing while Willis relayed the coordinates to our battery. "They're setting up in defilade position behind that ridge. Our standard barrage won't touch them there." "Battery commander requests fire mission confirmation, sir." I calculated quickly. "Tell them to use K47 as reference. Adjust fire. 200 yards west, 150 yards north. Elevation adjustment plus 15 degrees to clear the ridge." Within minutes, our 6-inch howitzers opened fire. I watched as the first shells landed wide of the target. Correction. Shift. 50 yards east, fire for effect. The next salvo found its mark. Through my glasses, I saw direct hits on the German position, equipment and men thrown into the air by the explosions. "Good shooting, sir," Willis said, a rare note of approval in his voice. That night, as I tried to sleep in my dugout, a new fear took hold. The Germans would know their gun positions had been spotted from the air. They would increase their efforts to eliminate our observation balloons. Tomorrow would be more dangerous. I must have eventually fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Willis was shaking me awake. 0500, sir. Weather's marginal, but captain says we're going up anyway." The sky was overcast as we prepared for ascent. Low clouds threatening rain. Poor conditions for observation, but also offering some protection from enemy aircraft. Our balloon swayed in the pre-dawn breeze as the ground crew made final checks. "Weather might ground the German fighters," Willis offered, noticing my gaze fixed on the clouds. "And our protection as well," I replied. As we rose into the gray morning sky, I felt the familiar knot of fear in my stomach. The front lines came into view, illuminated by occasional artillery flashes. The rain had turned the battlefield into a vast quagmire, and I could see our troops struggling to move through mud that reached their knees. At 0700, I spotted movement in the German trenches. "They're preparing a counterattack," I told Willis. "Infantry massing in the support trenches, sector D2. Willis called in the coordinates while I continued observing. Within minutes, our artillery opened fire, shells raining down on the assembling German troops. Through my glasses, I watched men being thrown into the air, trenches collapsing, chaos spreading through the enemy positions. "Adjust fire 100 yards east," I instructed, and Willis relayed the correction. The artillery responded, shifting their aim. More explosions tore through the German lines. The counterattack dissolved before it could begin. The survivors, retreating to their rear positions. By midday, the clouds had started to break, sunlight piercing through in patches. It made observation easier, but increased our vulnerability. I found myself constantly scanning the skies between artillery spotting tasks. At 14:30, as we were directing fire on a German machine gun nest, I spotted 3 dots approaching from the east. Aircraft. 3 of them, I said, training. My glasses on the distant shapes. "Ours or theirs?" Willis asked, tensing beside me. I waited, trying to identify the approaching planes. "German. Fokker triplanes." Willis immediately grabbed the telephone. "Enemy aircraft approaching Balloon 6. Request immediate descent." The ground crew began winching us down, but the process was agonizingly slow. The Fokkers grew larger in my field glasses. Their red fuselage is now clearly visible. "They've spotted us," I said, my mouth dry with fear. One of the aircraft broke formation, heading directly toward our balloon, while the others continued toward the British lines. Willis and I checked our parachute harnesses, preparing to jump if necessary. "How much longer until we're down?" I asked. Willis spoke into the telephone, then turned to me. They're bringing us down as fast as they can, sir, but he never finished the sentence. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the air around us, missing the balloon but cutting one of the control lines. The basket lurched violently. He's coming around for another pass, Willis shouted. I could see the German pilot clearly now. His face hidden behind goggles, but his intent unmistakable. The Fokker banked sharply, lining up for a second attack run. Jump, sir. Now! I hesitated, frozen by terror. The German fighter opened fire again. Bullets ripping through the balloon envelope above us. Hydrogen began leaking with an audible hiss. Jump or we're dead! Willis screamed, pushing me toward the edge of the basket. I finally overcame my paralysis, climbing over the edge and hanging by my hands for a moment before letting go. The sudden sensation of falling was overwhelming. I pulled my parachute ripcord immediately, feeling a violent jerk as the canopy deployed. Looking up, I saw Willis jumping clear just as the German pilot made a third pass. This time, his incendiary. Bullets found their mark. The hydrogen ignited with a massive whoosh, the balloon transforming into a fireball. The heat reached me even as I drifted downward. Willis's parachute opened successfully, and I watched him descending about 50 yards away. Above us, the burning remains of our balloon fell to earth, pieces of flaming fabric drifting like deadly snowflakes. My relief was short-lived. The Fokker, having destroyed the balloon, now turned its attention to us. Two helpless targets, hanging from parachutes. I watched in horror as the aircraft lined up on Willis, machine guns blazing. His body jerked as bullets tore through him, his parachute continuing to lower his lifeless form to the ground. The Fokker banked again, coming for me next. I could do nothing but hang there, completely exposed. I closed my eyes, waiting for the bullets to hit. The distinctive sound of a British Sopwith Camel's engine made me look up again. One of our fighters had arrived, engaging the Fokker in a swirling dogfight overhead. The German pilot, forced to defend himself, abandoned his attack on me. I landed roughly in a shell crater, half filled with muddy water. Struggling out of my parachute harness, I crawled to the edge and watched the aerial battle continuing above. The Sopwith had been joined by another, and together they drove off the remaining German aircraft. Two stretcher bearers found me there 30 minutes later, still staring at the sky. Lieutenant McCallum? One asked. Are you wounded, sir? I shook my head, unable to speak. Your sergeant didn't make it, the man said gently. Sorry, sir. That night, in the aid station where they'd taken me for shock, Captain Hendry visited. You did well, McCallum. The information you provided this morning prevented a major counterattack. Probably saved hundreds of lives. I said nothing, seeing only Willis's body jerking as the bullet struck him. We're short on experienced observers, Hendry continued after an uncomfortable silence. How soon can you go back up? I looked at him, wondering if he was joking, but his expression was deadly serious. I don't know, sir. He nodded as if expecting this answer. Take 2 days. Report back on the 29th. We're bringing in new balloons, improved models, less flammable. He paused. They're still working on that part. After he left, I lay on my cot, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. In 2 days, I would be back in the sky, suspended in a fragile basket, watching death unfold below while waiting for it to find me from above. The thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange numbness. The paranoia that had built over weeks had been replaced by certainty. I would die up there, just as Willis had, just as Lieutenant Ross would have if he'd been less lucky. It wasn't a question of if, only when. Somehow this knowledge was almost comforting, like acknowledging the inevitable fall of night after day. 2 days later, I reported for duty with a new sergeant beside me, ascending into the morning sky to direct the guns of the 51st Highland Division. my eyes scanning the horizon for the fighter that would eventually find me. Lieutenant James McGregor, 28 years old, 4th Battalion, Seaforth Highlanders, 51st Highland Division, born in Inverness, Scotland. The German's helmet gleamed for just a fraction of a second as the morning sun caught its edge. That was all I needed. I held my breath, feeling my heartbeat slow as I squeezed the trigger of my pattern 1914 Enfield. The rifle barely moved against my shoulder as it fired. Through my scope, I watched the German, Officer Crumple, his map case falling open as he hit the mud. His companions scattered like startled birds, diving for cover. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The Germans knew a sniper had fired, and their counter-sniper would be searching for me now. This deadly game had been going on for 3 weeks. I'd taken 8 confirmed kills, but the German sniper across no man's land had 11. He was hunting me as surely as I was hunting him. Each morning, I changed position, finding new hides among the ruins of what had once been the village of Beaumont Hamel. Each day, I watched through my scope as he did the same. We were locked in our own private war, while thousands of men huddled in trenches around us. A war of patience, of stillness, of minute calculations about wind and distance. A war where the winner lived and the loser died without even hearing the shot that killed him. I lay completely still among the rubble of what had once been a church bell tower, my body aching from holding the same position for hours. My spotter, Corporal Duncan, had been killed 3 days ago by my unseen enemy. Now I hunted alone, the crushing weight of isolation pressing down harder than the stones that concealed me. Somewhere out there, watching and waiting, was the deadliest man I'd ever encountered. And only one of us would leave this place alive. The rain had finally stopped after 4 miserable days of downpour that turned our trenches into canals of liquid mud. April 1916 along the Somme was proving to be a nightmare of wet cold that chilled to the bone and never relented. The upcoming big push was all anyone talked about, but for now, our sector remained relatively quiet except for the occasional artillery barrage and the constant danger of snipers. I hadn't always been a sniper. Before the war, I'd been a gamekeeper on Lord Seaforth's estate. I could track deer across the Highlands and put a bullet through a stag's heart at 300 yards. When I enlisted, my marksmanship quickly caught the attention of my superiors. After Lewes, where we'd taken terrible casualties, I was pulled from regular infantry duties and given special training. "McGregor," Major Campbell had said, "you'll be doing specialized work now. We're losing too many good men to German snipers. Time we gave them a taste of their own medicine." I was issued the Enfield with a scope, paired with Duncan as my spotter, and sent to hunt. There's an intimacy to killing as a sniper that regular soldiers don't experience. You watch your targets for hours sometimes, see them eat, joke with their mates, write letters home. Then you end them with the squeeze of a trigger. It's not like charging across no man's land where the enemy is just a uniform. As a sniper, you see the man before you take his life. At 0530, I carefully made my way from our forward trench to my new position in the ruins of a farmhouse that overlooked the German lines. Intelligence reported a German officer was expected to inspect their forward positions this morning. High-value target. The light was still gray, the sun not yet risen as I settled into position among broken stone walls. The farmhouse gave me good elevation and clear sight lines to a section of German trench where they'd been improving their wire defenses. If the officer was coming, that's where he'd inspect. 2 hours passed. Nothing. My muscles cramped, but I dared not move. Movement kills snipers. I controlled my breathing, taking slow, deliberate breaths as I'd been taught. The morning mist began to burn away as the sun rose behind me. Perfect conditions. The Germans would be looking into the sun while I remained in shadow. At 0747 movement, 3 figures emerged from a communication trench. 2 enlisted men and an officer with binoculars hanging around his neck. They stopped at intervals while the officer made notes. I tracked them through my scope, letting them move closer into my field of fire. I calculated distance, approximately 275 yards. Wind, light, from my right to left. I made my adjustments, tracking the officer's head in my crosshairs. He paused, pointing at something in their wire. I exhaled halfway, held it, and squeezed. The officer dropped instantly. His companions dove for cover, dragging his body into the trench. A clean kill. I remained motionless, waiting. This was the dangerous time. The Germans would be scanning for me now, and their sniper, if he was watching, would have seen my muzzle flash. 20 minutes later, I heard the whisper crack of a bullet passing inches from my head, followed by the distant report of a rifle. I didn't flinch, though my heart hammered in my chest. He'd missed. Barely. I carefully, painstakingly inched backward from my position, staying low behind the stone wall until I was certain I couldn't be seen. Only then did I move more quickly through the ruins back toward our lines. Captain Russell was waiting for me when I returned. "Successful?" he asked. "One officer. Clean shot." He nodded. "Good. But McGregor, we've received reports of a new German sniper in this sector, fellow named Schmidt. Apparently he's quite good. 11 of our lads in the past 2 weeks." "I know," I replied. "He nearly had me just now." Russell's face darkened. "Then he's seen you. You'll need to be doubly careful from now on." I nodded, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Snipers who were seen didn't last long. "I'll need a new spotter. Duncan was killed 3 days ago. There's no one available with training. You'll have to work alone for now." I accepted this with a nod, though working without a spotter was far more dangerous. No one to watch your back, no one to help spot targets or calculate distance. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw crosshairs, centered on my forehead. This German, Schmidt, was hunting me specifically now. We'd entered into that most personal of battlefield relationships, a sniper duel. In the morning, I would find a new position, and he would be looking for me. One of us would die. This certainty hung over me like the blade of a guillotine. Dawn came too quickly. I gathered my equipment: rifle, ammunition, canteen, field, glasses, and the camouflage burlap I used to break up my outline. No food. Too risky to eat while in position. I left our trench in the false dawn, moving carefully through a shallow depression that ran perpendicular to the lines. The ruins of Beaumont Hamel offered numerous potential hiding spots, but many would already be known to the Germans. I needed somewhere unexpected. The collapsed church had possibilities. Its bell tower had partially fallen, creating a jumble of stone and timber that overlooked the German positions. It would be difficult to reach, requiring me to cross 30 yards of open ground, but if I could make it, the position would give me excellent fields of fire. I waited until a German flare faded, then sprinted across the exposed ground, diving into the shadow of the ruined church wall. I lay still, listening, but heard nothing except distant shelling and the occasional chatter of a machine gun far down the line. Carefully, I worked my way up through the ruins, testing each foothold before putting my weight on it. One noise, one falling stone, could give me away. It took nearly 45 minutes to reach my chosen position among the bell tower rubble. I arranged my camouflage, settled my rifle on its rest, and began my watch. The morning passed slowly. I spotted several potential targets but held my fire. Taking a shot would reveal my position, and I wanted Schmidt to show himself first. This was the cruel arithmetic of the sniper. Patience against time. Wait too long and you might miss your chance. Fire too soon and you might die for it. At 1342, movement caught my eye. A German soldier emerging from their line, moving carefully through a shell hole. Something about his movements struck me as odd. Too cautious, too deliberate. He wasn't a regular infantryman. He was a sniper, changing position. I tracked him through my scope. He was good, using the terrain for cover, moving only when he thought it was safe. I could have taken the shot, but held off. If this was Schmidt, killing him would be a victory, but I wanted to be certain. He disappeared into the ruins of a farmhouse about 320 yards from my position. I memorized the spot, watching for any glint of a scope or movement at the windows. Nothing. He was disciplined. As the afternoon wore on, the weight of being watched pressed down on me. Every instinct screamed that crosshairs were searching for me, that death could come at any moment. The psychological burden of the sniper's trade is as heavy as any physical load. We dealt in fear as much as bullets. At 16:58, I spotted a German lieutenant moving down their trench, clearly visible from the shoulders up. An easy target at 300 yards. I hesitated. It could be bait, a ploy to draw me out. Schmidt might be waiting for my muzzle flash. But a target was a target. I made my calculations, aimed carefully, and fired. The lieutenant dropped from view. I immediately shifted position, sliding 3 feet to my right, staying low behind the stones. The crack of a bullet striking where my head had been a second earlier confirmed my suspicions. Schmidt had been waiting. Now we both knew approximately where the other was hiding. Darkness fell, bringing no relief. I couldn't risk moving at night. The Germans had illumination flares that would catch me in the open. I was trapped in my position until dawn, cold, hungry, and acutely aware that my enemy knew roughly where I was. I didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow seemed to herald approach or danger. The night stretched endlessly, punctuated by flares, distant gunfire, and the moans of wounded men in no man's land. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed by constant vigilance. With the first light, I carefully scanned the farmhouse where I'd seen Schmidt disappear. Nothing moved, but that meant little. He was as patient as I was. At 0826, a glint of light from the farmhouse. Sunlight reflecting off glass. His scope. For just a moment, I had him. I aimed and fired in one smooth motion. The report of my rifle was echoed almost instantly by another shot. Something slammed into my left shoulder, spinning me against the stone wall. Hot pain bloomed across my chest. I'd been hit. I didn't cry out. Couldn't afford to. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I checked my wound. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed bone and lung. Painful, debilitating, but not immediately. Fatal. I tore a strip from my shirt and bound it as best I could. Had I hit Schmidt? I couldn't tell. No movement came from the farmhouse, but that proved nothing. We were both too professional to reveal whether we'd been hit. Blood soaked through my makeshift bandage. I was weakening, but couldn't move. To show myself would mean death. I had to wait for full darkness. The hours passed in a haze of pain and thirst. I rationed tiny sips from my canteen, fighting to stay conscious. The sun began to set, painting the ruined landscape in reds and oranges that reminded me cruelly of the Highlands at dusk. As true darkness fell, I carefully gathered my rifle and gear. Every movement sent fresh agony through my wounded shoulder. I'd lost blood, too much probably, and my head swam with the effort of standing. I made my way slowly down through the ruins, each footstep a careful negotiation between speed and silence. Halfway down, my foot dislodged a stone that clattered noisily down the rubble. I froze, waiting for a shot that never came. Reaching the base of the church ruins, I faced the 30 yards of open ground I'd crossed yesterday. It seemed impossibly vast now. Gathering my remaining strength, I waited for a flare to fade, then staggered across the open ground toward our lines. I was halfway across when a flare burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. I dropped, playing dead, praying that Schmidt wasn't watching. The light seemed to last forever before finally fading. I crawled the remaining distance, my wounded shoulder leaving a dark trail in the mud. Reaching our wire, I called out the password in a hoarse whisper. Hands pulled me into the trench. "Christ, McGregor, you look half dead," said Sergeant Wallace. "Schmidt?" I managed to ask as they carried me toward the aid station. "The German sniper? Found dead this morning in a farmhouse. Shot through the eye, they say. Must have happened yesterday. One of ours got him." I closed my eyes, a strange mix of relief and emptiness washing over me. Our duel was over. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. Another skilled man dead, another, life ended by my hand. In the midst of a war that had already claimed millions, our private contest of skill and nerve seemed both vitally important and utterly meaningless. As the stretcher bearers carried me away from the line, I knew I'd return once my wound healed. The division needed snipers, and I was still one of the best. But something had changed. The fear that had driven me, the paranoia of being watched, of being hunted, had burned away, replaced by a cold acceptance of my role in this industrial slaughter. We called it the Great War. There was nothing great about it. Just men killing men across muddy fields, some with bayonets and bombs, others, like Schmidt and me, with patience and precision. One bullet at a time. Sapper Andrew McCallum, 24 years old. 250th Tunnelling Company, Royal Engineers, attached to 51st Highland Division, born in Inverness, Scotland. Underground, every noise could mean death. I press my ear against the cold, damp clay of our tunnel wall, holding my breath to catch the faintest sound. They're coming. The candle beside me barely illuminates the cramped space, its flame unnaturally still in the stagnant air. My hands are trembling, but I force them to remain steady on the wooden listening post. 20 meters of solid earth separate us from the German tunnelers, yet I can hear them. The rhythmic tap of pickaxes, the scrape of shovels, the muffled voices growing louder each hour. "They're coming straight for us," I whisper to Reynolds, my voice tight with fear. "Moving faster than yesterday." He nods grimly, making a notation in our logbook. In the flickering candlelight, his face is gaunt, eyes sunken from weeks underground. We haven't seen daylight in 9 days. "How much time?" he asks. I place my geophone against the wall again, listening through the primitive stethoscope. The knot in my stomach tightens as I calculate. 18 hours, maybe less. We both know what that means. By this time tomorrow, either we blow our countermining charge or the Germans detonate beneath our feet. In this silent war beneath the Western Front, whoever listens best lives. And right now, death is digging toward us, one shovelful at a time. I never planned to fight my war beneath the earth. Before the trenches swallowed Europe, I was a mining engineer in the Highland coal fields. When war came, I thought my experience would keep me above ground, perhaps building fortifications or repairing railways. Then the army discovered the Germans were tunneling beneath no man's land to detonate mines under our trenches. They needed men who understood the language of earth and stone. I volunteered immediately. Mining coal had taught me to respect the ground beneath my feet, how it shifts, breathes, and sometimes kills. What I didn't understand then was how this underground war would transform me, how the constant darkness would seep into my soul, how the endless listening for death would reshape my mind. My first day with the 250th Tunnelling Company came after 2 weeks of rushed training. Captain Willis, our commanding officer, led me through the communication trenches toward the front line. It was February 1916, and the 51st Highland Division held a section of line near Vimy Ridge. The winter had turned the trenches into channels of half-frozen mud that sucked at our boots with each step. The Boche have been active underground along this whole sector, Willis explained as we picked our way forward. We've lost 3 sections of trench to mine explosions in the past month. Your job is to find them before they find us. At a dugout reinforced with corrugated iron and sandbags, Willis stopped and gestured to a dark opening in the trench wall. Welcome to the underworld, McCallum. The tunnel entrance was barely wider than my shoulders. A crude wooden ladder descended into darkness. The smell rising from below was a nauseating mixture of wet earth, sweat, and the distinct chemical tang of explosives. 23 meters down, then lateral galleries extending toward the German lines, Willis continued. You'll be on listening duty with Corporal Reynolds. 8-hour shifts. Listen for digging, report any activity. If they get too close, we plant a camouflage and collapse their tunnel. I nodded, trying to mask my apprehension. And if we miss them, sir, Willis's expression hardened. Then they blow us to kingdom come. I descended the ladder into the earth, each rung taking me farther from the war above into a different kind of hell below. At the bottom, a narrow passage stretched ahead, barely tall enough to stand in, supported by timber frames every few feet. Candles in clay niches provided the only light, their flames burning strangely in the oxygen-poor air. Corporal Reynolds was waiting for me, a wiry man with a permanently stooped posture from months of working in tunnels too small for his frame. You the new listener? He asked, eyeing me skeptically. Sapper McCallum, sir. Mining experience from Inverness. Forget everything you know about mining, Reynolds said flatly. This isn't about getting coal out. It's about staying quiet and finding Fritz before he finds you. He handed me a geophone, a primitive listening device with 2 earpieces connected to a metal plate. This is your best friend now. Learn to sleep with 1 ear on it. That first week underground was the longest of my life. The tunnel system extended like a spider's web beneath no man's land, with listening posts positioned at strategic intervals. Each post was a cramped alcove, barely large enough for 2 men to sit side by side, with wooden boards pressed against the tunnel walls to amplify vibrations. Time lost all meaning in the perpetual darkness. We worked by candlelight, marking 8-hour shifts with pocket watches that seemed to move slower with each passing day. The air was thick and stale, tasting of clay and cordite. Water constantly seeped through the walls, dripping onto our uniforms until they clung to our skin, cold and clammy. But worse than the conditions was the silence. A silence so profound it became a physical presence. For hours I would press my ear against the listening board, straining to hear any sound from the German tunnelers. The slightest tap or scrape would set my heart racing. Was it just settling earth? A rat scurrying through the darkness? Or the enemy, digging steadily toward us with explosive charges? You need to learn the difference between earth sounds and man sounds, Reynolds told me during my 3rd day. Earth groans, shifts, settles. Men tap, scrape, and mutter. Earth sounds move slow, man sounds have rhythm. I learned quickly. Had to. Men who learned slowly died, buried beneath tons of collapsed tunnels, or vaporized in underground explosions that left craters the size of village churches on the surface above. By my 2nd week, I could distinguish between natural vibrations and human activity. I could tell how many men were working, what tools they were using, and their approximate distance. I could even discern the difference between German tunneling techniques and our own. They used specialized boring equipment that made a distinctive, whirring sound. We relied more on pick and shovel work, slower but quieter. It was during my 3rd week that I experienced my first mine explosion. I was off duty, trying to sleep in our underground billet, a slightly wider section of tunnel fitted with wooden bunks, when the earth suddenly convulsed. The timbers creaked ominously, and a shower of dirt rained down from the ceiling. For a terrifying moment, I thought our entire tunnel system would collapse. "German mine!" someone shouted as men scrambled from their bunks. "Eastern gallery!" We rushed to check for damage, carrying emergency timber supports. The explosion had occurred nearly 100 meters away, beneath the forward trench. The Germans had detonated 5,000 pounds of ammonal, obliterating 30 meters of trench and burying an entire platoon of Highland infantry. From our tunnel, we could hear the muffled screams of survivors trapped in collapsed dugouts. They must have worked through our detection zone, Captain Willis said grimly as we assessed the damage.
"We need to extend our listening posts farther east." That night, as I lay sleepless in my bunk, the reality of this underground war truly sank in. Above ground, you could at least see death coming, the flash of artillery, the arc of mortar.
Rounds, the enemy advancing across no man's land. Down here, death was invisible, a silent presence, digging inexorably toward you through the darkness. The fear became a constant companion, a cold weight in the pit of my stomach. Every creak of timber, every pebble falling from the ceiling, sent a jolt of terror through me. I began to imagine the Germans everywhere, their tunnels encircling us, their explosives planted directly beneath us. Reynolds noticed my deteriorating state after a month underground. "You're listening too hard, McCallum," he said during one shift. "You'll drive yourself mad that way." "How can you listen too hard when your life depends on it?" I asked. He shook his head. "There's listening, and then there's hearing things that aren't there. Earth plays tricks on your ears after a while. Start hearing phantom diggers, you're no good to anyone." But I couldn't stop listening. Even off duty, my mind strained for sounds, for warnings. I developed a habit of pressing my hand against tunnel walls whenever I walked, feeling for vibrations. I slept with my ear against the earth, waking in panic from dreams of German sappers breaking through our tunnel wall. It wasn't just me. All of us tunnelers developed strange habits. Malone from Belfast carried a small pouch of soil from his garden, claiming it would guide him home. Webster refused to light 3 candles at once, convinced it was an omen of cave-ins. Reynolds kept a dead canary in a matchbox. A grim reminder of the constant danger of gas pockets. We were becoming creatures of the underground, more comfortable in darkness than daylight. The rare occasions when we emerged to the surface left us blinking and disoriented. The vast, open sky somehow more terrifying than the crushing weight of earth above our tunnels. The German tunneling activity increased throughout the spring of 1916. Our listening posts detected multiple new galleries being dug toward our lines. It became a deadly chess match played through solid earth. We would detect their approach, plant a small camouflage charge to collapse their tunnel, then rapidly withdraw and seal our own access tunnel. Sometimes we were too late. In April, we lost an entire section of our tunnel system when a German mine detonated directly beneath one of our main galleries. 5 men simply vanished, their bodies pulverized and buried beneath tons of collapsed earth. There were no graves, no remains to send home, just names added to the growing list of the missing. In May, Captain Willis assigned me and Reynolds to a new listening post in our most forward tunnel, just 20 meters from where we believed the Germans were working. For a week, we detected nothing unusual, just the distant, familiar sounds of their routine tunneling operations. Then, on the 7th day, everything changed. I was on the geophone when I first heard it, a new sound, rhythmic and purposeful, coming directly toward our position. "They've changed direction," I told Reynolds, my mouth dry with fear. "They're heading straight for us." He took the geophone, listened for several minutes, then nodded grimly. "Boring machine, moving fast." We reported to Captain Willis immediately. His response was calm but immediate. Prepare a camouflage. 500 pounds of ammonol, positioned to intercept there. Line of advance will detonate when they're within 10 meters. For the next 3 days, we maintained constant listening watches as the explosives were brought forward and positioned. The German tunneling grew steadily louder. I could now hear not just their machinery, but their voices, muffled German phrases, passing through 20 meters of chalk and clay. "They're getting close," I reported at the end of my shift. "I estimate 15 meters and closing." Reynolds nodded. "We'll blow the charge tomorrow morning. Be ready to seal this gallery immediately after detonation." That night, trying to sleep in our billets, I couldn't escape the thought that we were too late, that the Germans already knew our position and were preparing their own, larger mine. Every creak of the timber supports, every distant rumble from the battlefield above, convinced me that annihilation was moments away. By morning, my nerves were shredded. As Reynolds and I took our positions at the listening post, the German tunneling sounds were clearer than ever. 10 meters, I whispered. The geophone pressed hard against the tunnel wall. Maybe less. Reynolds checked the detonator wire running, back to our camouflage charge. "They're right where we want them. I'll signal the captain." As he moved to the field telephone, a new sound froze my blood. A distinct, methodical tapping directly ahead of our position. "Wait," I hissed. "They've stopped boring. They're using hand tools now." Reynolds paused, then returned and took the geophone. After listening intently, his face paled. "They're planting their own charge. We need to detonate now." He rushed to the telephone, frantically turning the crank. "Fire position 1. Immediate detonation. They're setting charges." What happened next seemed to unfold in terrible slow motion. As Reynolds shouted into the telephone, I heard a new sound through the geophone. A crisp, metallic click that could only be a detonator being set. "Get out!" I screamed, ripping the geophone away and lunging for Reynolds. "They're blowing now!" We had barely turned toward the tunnel entrance when the earth convulsed. The blast wave hit like a physical blow, slamming us against the tunnel wall. Timbers cracked and splintered as the roof collapsed behind us. The concussion extinguished every candle, plunging us into absolute darkness filled with choking dust. "Crawl forward," Reynolds shouted through the chaos. "Stay low!" I couldn't see him, couldn't see anything, but I could feel the tunnel collapsing. Behind us, as we scrambled forward on hands and knees, the air grew thick with dust and the terrible groaning of failing support timbers. After what seemed like an eternity, hands grabbed us, pulling us into the relative safety of the main gallery. Captain Willis and a rescue team had been rushing forward when our camouflage detonated in response to the German explosion. "Seal it off," Willis ordered as timber beams continued to crack behind us. "The whole forward section is going." As Sappers hurriedly constructed an emergency bulkhead, I sat against the tunnel wall, coughing dust from my lungs. Reynolds collapsed beside me, his face gray with chalk dust except for clean tracks where sweat had run down his cheeks. "That was too bloody close," he wheezed. I nodded, unable to speak, the ringing in my ears drowning out all other sounds. We had survived by seconds. Another moment's hesitation, and we would have been entombed forever beneath no man's land. Our bodies never to be recovered. Later, after the emergency bulkhead was completed and the danger of further collapse had passed, Captain Willis debriefed us in the company dugout. "You did well," he said, pouring each of us a measure of whiskey from his private flask. "That was the closest call we've had yet." "They knew exactly where we were," I said, my hands still trembling slightly as I raised the tin cup. "It wasn't random tunneling. They were coming directly for us." Willis nodded grimly. "They're getting better at detection. So must we." That night, even exhausted as I was, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that metallic click of the German detonator. I felt the earth shake, the timbers splitting, the crushing weight of darkness. I knew then that I would never escape this underground war, even if I survived to see the end of the fighting. Part of me would always be there, ear pressed against cold earth, listening for death digging toward me. And so it continues. Each day, we dig new tunnels, establish new listening posts, plant new explosives. Each night I lie awake, hearing sounds that may or may not be real. The Germans are always there, just beyond the next layer of earth, invisible but present, waiting, digging, listening. Just as I am listening now, ear pressed against clay, straining to hear their approach. The ground speaks if you know how to listen, and right now, it's telling me they're coming.
Corporal Alistair McPherson, 27 years old, 250th Tunneling Company, Royal Engineers, attached to 51st Highland Division. Born in Scotland, something shook the ground beneath our feet. Not the rumble of artillery we'd grown accustomed to, but something far more terrifying. A deep, primal movement beneath our feet. Dirt rained from the ceiling of our tunnel as timber supports creaked under sudden strain. My carbide lamp flickered, casting wild shadows across the faces of my men, their eyes wide with the realization of what was happening. "German countermine," I hissed, instinctively dropping my voice to a whisper, though the enemy diggers couldn't possibly hear me over their own work. "Douse the lamps." In the sudden darkness, I heard the men fumbling for their weapons. The familiar slide of bayonets being fixed provided small comfort. If the Germans broke through, the fight would be brutal, with pick handles, sharpened shovels, and revolvers in a space barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. I pressed my ear against the tunnel wall, the clay cold against my cheek. The scratching sounds were closer now. I estimated no more than 10 feet of earth between us and them. Lieutenant Gordon had taught us to listen for the different sounds. The dull thud of a pick meant they were still in clay, while the sharp crack of a spade hitting chalk meant they were moving faster than we'd like. "McGregor, run back to the shaft. Tell Lieutenant Gordon we've got Fritz heading our way, approximately 10 feet out at bearing 275. My voice remained calm despite the hammering of my heart. "The rest of you prepare the camouflage charges. If they break through, we blow the whole bloody tunnel." I felt rather than saw Davy Campbell's hand grip my shoulder in the darkness. "Aye, Corp. If we're going to meet our maker, might as well take some Germans with us." I allowed myself a grim smile as I reached for the detonator. The war above ground was hell enough, but here, 30 feet below no man's land, we fought a different kind of war entirely. A silent, strangling war of darkness, deadly gases, and crushing earth, where your closest friend was the man sharing your fear in the damp blackness, and your worst enemy wasn't the German you couldn't see, but the unforgiving ground eager to become your grave. I joined the Royal Engineers in 1915 after serving with the 4th Battalion, Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. The Army found my background in coal mining more valuable underground than my rifle skills were in the trenches. While my friends from Inverness marched together under the Highland Division's insignia, I was sent to train with the tunnelers. Our posting to the Ypres salient in early 1916 brought me back under the Highland Division's umbrella, though our tunneling company remained somewhat separate. Specialists in this underground war, we were a mixed lot. Coal miners from Fife and Lanarkshire, tin miners from Cornwall, and clay kickers from London. What united us was our experience working beneath the ground and our willingness to do so under conditions that would have made civilian mining inspectors shut down operations immediately. The day began like many others, with Lieutenant Gordon briefing us in the small dugout that served as our company headquarters. A young university-educated engineer who'd learned to respect the practical knowledge of men like us, Gordon had pinned up the latest surveys of our tunnel system on the chalk wall. "Gentlemen, intelligence believes the Germans are counter-digging. Here," he said, pointing to an area approximately 50 yards northeast of our forward tunnel. "Our listeners have picked up activity, but it's faint. We need to extend Tunnel 4 to intercept them before they can place charges under our front line." The plan was simple enough. Extend our tunnel to intersect with the presumed German countermine, then prepare a camouflage. A small underground charge meant to collapse enemy tunnels without disturbing the surface. "McPherson, you'll lead the digging team," Gordon said. "Select 5 men and start immediately. Work as quietly as possible. We don't want them changing course if they hear us coming. I nodded, already mentally selecting my team. Campbell and Fraser as diggers, Murray and McGregor as timbermen, and young Wallace to work the air pump and remove spoil. All Highlanders, all men who'd followed me down before and come back up again. By 0430, we were at work. The tunnel was a cramped affair, barely 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. We worked in shifts, 2 men digging at the face, while another handled the spoil, placing it into sandbags that were passed hand to hand back to the main shaft. The other men shored up the excavation with timber frames every few feet. The work was exhausting, performed in near silence, save for the necessary whispered commands and the muffled sounds of picks and shovels biting into earth. The air grew, increasingly stale despite Wallace's efforts with the hand pump, and the carbide lamps burned with a weak, yellowish flame that did little to push back the oppressive darkness. We'd extended the tunnel by nearly 15 feet by 1200, when Fraser, taking his turn at the face, suddenly froze. He raised his hand in the signal for silence, then pressed his ear to the wall. After a moment, he turned to me with wide eyes. "They're close, Corp," he whispered. "Can't be more than 20 feet off." I crawled forward to listen for myself. The sound was unmistakable. The dull thud of picks striking clay, the occasional scrape of a shovel, and most telling, the muffled sound of German voices. "Right, lads," I said, gathering my team. "We've got company ahead. We'll continue forward, but with extra caution. No talking, muffle your tools with rags, and we'll use hand signals only. Campbell, prepare the charges. If they break through..." Unexpectedly, we need to be ready. The atmosphere in the tunnel changed immediately. The already tense environment became charged with a new kind of fear. Unlike the random danger of artillery above ground, this was a deliberate, creeping threat. Unseen enemies moving steadily closer through the earth, both sides engaged in a deadly race. We worked more slowly now, pausing frequently to listen. The German digging grew louder with each foot we advanced. By 1530, I estimated they were no more than 15 feet away, angling in from our right. I sent McGregor back to inform Lieutenant Gordon of our progress and request instructions. He returned 30 minutes later with our orders. "Lieutenant says to continue forward, but prepare a defensive position. If they break through, we're to fight. Under no circumstances are we to detonate unless ordered." This wasn't surprising. Our tunnel was part of a larger system meant to eventually place massive mines under the German positions. Command wouldn't want to risk the entire operation by causing a premature collapse that might alert the enemy to our broader intentions. "You heard the man," I said. "Fraser, Murray, continue digging, but slower now. Campbell, set up the charges 20 feet back as our last resort. McGregor, Wallace, prepare the defensive position here." Our defensive preparations were simple, but effective. We widened a section of tunnel slightly to create a fighting position, reinforced it heavily with timber, and positioned ourselves with revolvers, grenades, and improvised weapons. In the confines of a tunnel, firearms were of limited use. The noise and muzzle flash could disorient the user as much as the enemy, and the risk of bringing down the tunnel with an errant shot was ever present. Instead, we relied on sharpened entrenching tools, pick handles, and knives. By 1830, we could clearly hear the Germans working. Their voices, though muffled by earth, were distinct enough that Murray, who'd worked with German miners in Northumberland before the war, could catch snippets of conversation. "They're arguing about the direction," he whispered. "One thinks they should turn more northward, the other wants to continue on their current heading." This was valuable intelligence. If they turned north, they'd miss us entirely. If they continued, a meeting was inevitable. "How many can you hear?" I asked. Murray pressed his ear to the wall again. "At least 3 distinct voices. Probably a team like ours." I nodded. Even odds then, if it came to a fight. We continued our careful advance as darkness fell above ground, though in our subterranean world, there was no difference between night and day. Only the eternal twilight of the carbide lamps and the constant threat of darkness should they fail. At 21:45, Fraser's pick struck through into empty space. He pulled back immediately, and we doused our lamps. In the perfect darkness, I crawled forward to investigate. A hole no larger than my fist had opened into what could only be the German tunnel. No light shone through, suggesting they're working. Face was currently unoccupied. They've dug past us on a parallel course, I whispered. Their tunnel is about 3 feet to our right. This is our chance. The decision I made then wasn't strictly by the book, but it was one born of experience. Rather than reporting back and waiting for orders, I chose to act. Campbell, bring the smallest charge. We're going to create a camouflage right here, right now, and collapse their tunnel while they're not at the face. Campbell grinned in the darkness. Aye, Corp. One German surprise coming up. We worked quickly but methodically, enlarging the hole just enough to pass through the small explosive charge, tamping it into the far wall of the German tunnel. We ran the detonation wire back 20 feet along our tunnel and prepared to blow the charge. Just as Campbell was connecting the wire to the detonator, we heard voices approaching in the German tunnel. They'd return to their face and would surely discover our breach any moment. Now, Campbell, I hissed. The explosion was carefully calculated, enough to collapse a section of their tunnel, but not so large as to threaten our own workings or reveal the explosion to observers on the surface. The dull thump was followed by the sound of falling earth and timber, and then muffled cries of alarm in German. We didn't wait to see the results. Following rehearsed procedure, we retreated quickly back along our tunnel to our prepared defensive position, in case any survivors attempted to break through to our side. For 20 minutes, we waited in tense silence, revolvers drawn. Occasionally, we could hear faint sounds of digging, survivors attempting to rescue their comrades, perhaps, but no attempt was made to break through to our tunnel. Think we got them all, Corp? Wallace asked, his young face pale in the dim light. Don't know, lad, I replied honestly. But we've set them back, that's for certain. Lieutenant Gordon arrived an hour later, having been informed of the explosion by our listeners posted in the main shaft, rather than the reprimand. I half expected for acting without orders, he clapped me on the shoulder. Well done, McPherson. Our listeners report significant activity in the German lines. They're bringing down rescue teams. You've not only secured our tunnel system, but likely eliminated an entire enemy sapping team. The grim reality of what that meant hung unspoken. Between us, men like us, doing the same job, now buried alive or crushed beneath tons of earth. There was no glory in it, no heroic charge across open ground, just the cold efficiency of underground warfare. 3 days later, we were back in the same tunnel, extending it further toward the German lines. The enemy had not attempted to countermine in this sector again, our decisive action having apparently convinced them to try elsewhere. As we worked, Campbell suddenly chuckled beside me. What's so funny? I asked, pausing to wipe sweat from my brow. Just thinking, he said, tamping down the earth around a newly placed timber frame. My da wanted me to follow him into the mines. I joined up to avoid spending my life underground. Now look at us. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Around the tunnel, tired faces broke into smiles and suppressed laughter. At least the pay's better, Murray offered. And the company, added Fraser. Never met a finer bunch of moles than you lot. This was the strange camaraderie of the tunnelers, men bound together by shared hardship and danger, finding humor in the darkest places. Above ground, the Highland Division fought with rifles and bayonets. Below, we fought a different war, but we carried the same spirit. That night, back in our dugout behind the lines, Lieutenant Gordon shared a rare bottle of whiskey with the team. As we savored the burning liquid, a taste of home for us Scots, he raised his tin cup. To the silent service, he said. The war no one sees. The silent service, we echoed, our voices low but united. The recognition meant more than any official commendation. In the tunnels, reputation and trust were the only currency that mattered. When your life depended on the man beside you, hearing a German pick before it broke through, or shoring up a timber frame before the earth could claim you, you learned quickly who you could rely on. As the Highland Division prepared for what would eventually become the Battle of Messines, our work continued day and night. Over the following months, we extended our tunnels, placed massive mines beneath the German positions, and fought our silent war beneath the feet of armies. The mines we helped place would eventually create one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, changing the landscape of the Western Front and giving the Allied forces a rare victory. But in the darkness of those narrow tunnels, such grand strategy meant little. Our world was measured in feet of earth moved, timber frames placed, and the trust between men who daily descended into the underworld, never certain they would emerge again. Yet emerge we did, carrying with us a bond forged in the damp darkness, beneath no man's land. A brotherhood not of blood, but of clay and chalk and shared fear overcome by trust in one another. While others fought for king and country, we tunnelers fought first and foremost for each other, our loyalty measured, not in patriotic speeches, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing that in the darkest places of the war, we never stood alone. Sergeant James Harlow, 24, Baker Company, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, born in Stillwater, Oklahoma. The whistle shrieked through the dawn mist, piercing my eardrums like a bayonet. My throat closed up. The lieutenant's arm dropped, and we rose as one, clambering over the fire step, fingers digging into mud. The parapet loomed before me, then fell away as I hauled myself over. My boots sank into churned earth that had swallowed thousands before. Meet! The wire lay ahead. Our wire, cut in places by the engineers during the night. Beyond that stretched 300 yards of hell. No man's land. The German machine guns opened up before I'd taken 5 steps. Bullets snapped overhead like angry hornets. To my right, Wilkins jerked backward, his helmet flying off, a dark hole appearing where his left eye had been. He dropped without a sound. On my left, Murphy screamed as his leg disappeared in a geyser of mud from a mortar round. The company surged forward, men hunched against the storm of lead, bayonets fixed. My lungs burned from the lingering gas of yesterday's bombardment. Through the mist and smoke, the German line waited, a jagged scar across the ravaged landscape. We were supposed to reach it. Most of us wouldn't. I ran, each step a desperate prayer. The taste of iron filling my mouth. Rain hammered the trench, turning the floor into a river of mud that reached our calves. Water dripped from my helmet, ran down my neck, and soaked through my uniform until I couldn't remember what being dry felt like. It had been raining for 3 days straight, and the walls of our trench were beginning to collapse in places. Our dugout leaked like a sieve. We'd been on the line for 19 days straight. The 1st Division, the big red one, had been thrown into this sector of the Western Front 6 weeks after arriving in France. None of us were ready. Training had been minimal. Most of the men couldn't field strip their rifles properly when we landed. Now they could do it blindfolded, shivering in water-filled shell holes while German artillery pounded overhead. Harlow, get your section ready. Lieutenant Parker appeared from around a traverse, his pale face barely visible beneath his helmet. We're sending a patrol out at 0200. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Parker was on his 3rd week at the front. His predecessor had lasted less than 2 days before a sniper put a round through his throat. Parker was learning, though. He kept his head down now. Raiding party? I asked. Reconnaissance only. Battalion wants to know if the Germans are reinforcing the line opposite us. Artillery reports increased movement behind their lines. I checked my watch. Nearly midnight. Yes, sir. We'll be ready. The lieutenant disappeared back the way he had come, shoulders hunched against the rain. I made my way along the fire bay, stepping over sleeping men curled against the walls of the trench. Most slept sitting up, leaning against each other for warmth, rifles cradled in their arms. It was too wet to lie down. Cooper was on watch, peering through a periscope at the German lines. See anything? I asked. Nothing moving, he replied, not taking his eye from the periscope. Too damn wet for even the boats to be out. We're going out at 0200, I told him. Lieutenant wants a look at their wire. Cooper finally looked away from the periscope. His face was gaunt, stubbled with a week's growth of beard. Who's we? You, me, Davis, Miller. Cooper spat into the mud. Miller's got trench foot so bad he can barely walk. Jennings then. Jennings took a piece of shrapnel yesterday. Evacuation station. I'd forgotten. The days blurred together, marked only by artillery barrages and the changing of the guard. Freeman, Cooper nodded. He'll do. Kids too stupid to be scared. Wake them up at 0130. No gear except pistols and trench knives. We're going quiet. Yes, Sergeant. Cooper turned back to his periscope, the conversation over. I made my way back to the dugout where the rest of my squad was sleeping. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sweet sour stench of gangrenous, wounds the medics couldn't keep up with. A single candle burned in a niche carved into the wall, casting long shadows over the huddled forms of sleeping men. Davis was awake, cleaning his Colt automatic by the dim light. He'd been a bank clerk in Philadelphia before the war. Now he was the best shot in the company and had a 1,000-yard stare that made new replacements avoid eye contact. Patrol tonight, I told him softly. He nodded without looking up. Who else? You, me, Cooper, Freeman. Freeman's green. He needs to learn. Davis continued cleaning his pistol, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. They all need to learn. Most don't live long enough. I couldn't argue with that. Our company had arrived in France with 250 men. We were down to 183, and most of those were replacements who joined us in the last month. I found my spot against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to catch some sleep before the patrol. The artillery started up. Again, German shells falling somewhere behind our lines. The ground trembled, and dirt sifted down from the ceiling of the dugout. The men didn't even wake up anymore unless a shell landed close enough to shake the whole trench. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Wilkins's face, the neat hole where his eye had been, or Murphy, screaming as the medics cut off what remained of his leg. Or the German boy I'd bayoneted 3 weeks ago during a raid, no older than 16, his eyes wide with surprise as my blade slid between his ribs. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, Davis was shaking me awake. Time, he said simply. I checked my watch, 0125. I nodded and got to my feet, my joints cracking after hours of sitting in the same position. My uniform was still damp, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. I strapped on my pistol belt and slid my trench knife into its sheath. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The night was pitch black, clouds hiding the moon and stars. Perfect weather for a patrol. Cooper and Freeman were waiting at the designated spot, their faces blackened with mud. Freeman looked terrified, his eyes too wide, fingers fidgeting with his knife sheath. Listen up, I whispered when we were all gathered. We go out through the sap trench at Point Baker 4. Our mission is observation only. We need to check their wire. Look for any signs they're bringing up reinforcements. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. If we get spotted, we scatter and make our way back individually. Questions? The men shook their heads. Freeman, you stay with me. Davis and Cooper, you two stay together. We move in pairs. 10 yards apart. Hand signals only once we're past our wire. Lieutenant Parker appeared, accompanied by a captain I didn't recognize. Sergeant Harlow, Parker said. This is Captain Reynolds from Battalion Intelligence. He'll be accompanying your patrol. I stiffened. Officers on patrols were trouble. They didn't know the ground like we did, and the Germans were always watching for the glint of officer insignia. Sir, with respect, we're moving as a small unit. Adding another man increases our risk of detection. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. He was older than most officers I'd seen, probably in his 30s, with a weathered face and calm eyes. I understand your concern, Sergeant. I've been on my fair share of patrols. I won't be a liability. I could see there was no point arguing. Yes, sir. You'll come with me and Freeman. We moved out at exactly 0200, creeping through the sap trench, a narrow ditch that extended out toward no man's land. The mud sucked at our boots, threatening to pull them off with each step. When we reached the end of the sap, we paused, listening intently. The night was filled with the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a rifle as nervous sentries fired at shadows. I peered over the edge. No man's land stretched before us, a wasteland of shell holes, tangled wire, and rotting corpses. The German line was barely visible, a darker shadow against the night sky approximately 200 yards away. I signaled to move out. Davis and Cooper went first, crawling on their bellies through the mud. Freeman, the captain, and I followed a minute later. We moved slowly, freezing at the slightest sound, using shell holes for cover whenever possible. The smell was overwhelming: decomposing bodies, lingering gas, excrement, and the sharp tang of cordite. We passed a corpse half buried in mud, the uniform unrecognizable, the face a blackened mask of corruption. Freeman gagged quietly beside me. I put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed, warning him to be silent. We were halfway across when a flare shot up from the German line, bathing no man's land in harsh white light. We froze instantly, pressing ourselves into the mud. The light lingered, impossibly bright after the darkness, revealing the horror of the battlefield in stark detail. Bodies in various states of decay, tangles of barbed wire, abandoned equipment. A blasted landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet more than the peaceful French countryside it had once been. The flare died away, plunging us back into darkness. We waited several minutes before moving again, even more cautiously than before. A machine gun opened up somewhere to our right, the rounds passing well over our heads, aimed at some imagined movement in Allied lines. We reached the German wire after nearly an hour of painfully slow progress. Their entanglements were in better shape than ours. 3 belts of barbed wire, each about 5 yards deep. I could see their parapet beyond, and the dim glow of light leaking from dugout entrances. Captain Reynolds produced a small notebook and began making sketches of the German positions. I strained my ears, catching fragments of conversation from the enemy trench. My German wasn't good, but I could make out enough to understand they were complaining about the food. A sudden commotion erupted from the trench, shouted orders, the sound of hobnailed boots on duckboards. I tensed, fearing we'd been spotted. But the activity wasn't directed at us. Men were moving up the communication trench behind their line. Reinforcements. Captain Reynolds was writing furiously in his notebook. I tapped his arm and pointed to my ear, then to the German line. He nodded, understanding that I'd heard something significant. We'd seen enough. I signaled to withdraw, and we began the long crawl back the way we'd come. Davis and Cooper were already moving, barely visible shadows against the dark ground. We were 3/4 of the way back to our lines when disaster struck. Freeman, exhausted and nervous, snagged his equipment on a strand of barbed wire we'd missed in the darkness. The wire twanged loudly as it snapped back. Instantly, a flare shot up, followed by the chatter of a machine gun. Bullets kicked up mud around us. "Scatter!" I hissed, shoving Freeman toward a nearby shell hole. The captain and I rolled in the opposite direction, tumbling into a water-filled crater. More flares went up, and now multiple machine guns were firing, crisscrossing no man's land with deadly patterns. I caught a glimpse of Davis and Cooper sprinting the final distance to our lines, diving into the sap trench just as bullets tore up the ground behind them. Freeman was pinned down, huddled in his shell hole as rounds impacted all around him. "We have to move," I told the captain. "When the next flare dies, we run for our lines. Don't stop for anything." Reynolds nodded, his face grim but determined. The flare sputtered out. We burst from our crater, running in a low crouch, zigzagging toward the Allied line. A fresh flare shot up when we were still 30 yards short. The machine guns found us immediately. I felt a hammer blow to my left shoulder, spinning me around. Pain exploded through my body, but I kept moving, stumbling forward. Captain Reynolds grabbed my good arm, half dragging me the final distance. Hands reached out from the trench, pulling us in. We collapsed onto the duckboards, gasping for breath. "Freeman?" I managed to ask. "Still out there," someone replied. I tried to rise, but the pain in my shoulder kept me down. Blood was soaking through my uniform, hot against my skin. A medic appeared, cutting away my tunic to expose the wound. "You're lucky," he said. Clean through the meat. Didn't hit bone or artery. I wasn't listening. My eyes were fixed on the parapet, watching for any sign of Freeman. The firing had stopped, but flares still occasionally lit up no man's. Land Captain Reynolds crouched beside me as the medic bandaged my shoulder. Your man might still make it. If he stays put until dawn, we can cover him with rifle fire. I nodded, but I knew Freeman's chances were slim. Few men survived a dawn in no man's land, exposed to snipers and machine guns. Dawn came with a misty rain. Freeman hadn't moved from his shell hole. Lieutenant Parker organized a covering party, riflemen who would pour fire on the German positions while volunteers went out to retrieve Freeman. I insisted on going, despite my wounded shoulder. Davis joined me without being asked. We crept out through the sap trench as the covering fire began, hundreds of rifles firing at the German parapets, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. We reached Freeman quickly. He was alive but hit badly, a bullet through his thigh. Another had grazed his head, leaving a bloody furrow along his scalp. "Took your time, Sarge," he whispered, his face gray with shock and blood loss. "Thought you could use the rest," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Davis and I fashioned a rough stretcher from our tunics and rifles, lifting Freeman onto it. The return journey was agonizing, my wounded shoulder screaming with every step, but somehow we made it back to our lines just as the covering fire began to slacken. In the aid station, the medics took Freeman away. Captain Reynolds found me, there, my shoulder being properly cleaned and dressed. "Your patrol provided valuable intelligence, Sergeant," he said. "The Germans are indeed reinforcing this sector. We'll be launching a major assault in 3 days to disrupt their plans." I nodded, too tired to speak. Another assault. More men climbing over the top. More bodies added to the churned mud of no man's land. 3 days later, the whistle blew again. I led what remained of my squad up and over the parapet, across no man's land, through a storm of bullets and shrapnel. Freeman was still in the field hospital. Davis fell halfway across, a machine gun bullet through his chest. Cooper made it to the German wire before a stick grenade blew off his right leg. I reached the German trench somehow, leaping down among startled defenders. My bayonet found flesh once, twice, 3 times. Men wrestled in the confined space, cursing, screaming, dying. The air filled with the stench of blood, excrement, and fear. When it was over, the survivors of the Big Red One held 300 yards of German trench. 243 men had died taking it. The ground we'd captured was abandoned 3 weeks later during a strategic withdrawal. I received a promotion to staff sergeant and a Silver Star. The citation mentioned heroism under fire. It said nothing about the mud, the rats, the smell of decomposing friends. Nothing about the hollow eyes of the men who survived. Nothing about the nightmares that would follow us home. The rain continued to fall on the western front, filling the shell holes, washing away the blood, burying the dead in liquid earth. And still the whistles blew, sending more men over the top, into the hell they called no man's land. Unteroffizier Maximilian Weber, 23, 4th Company, Sturmbataillon No. 5, born in Munich, Bavaria. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when the artillery fell silent. For 6 hours, our guns had hammered the French, lines without pause. The sudden quiet was more unsettling than the thunder of the shells. My ears rang in the silence. I checked my watch. 0430. Almost time. I looked at the men of my assault group crouched in the trench around me. 9 of them, faces blackened with burnt cork, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Each carried a distinctive kit. 3 stick grenades clipped to their belts, 2 more in each pocket. Pistols, trench knives, entrenching tools sharpened to a lethal edge. The elite of the German army, Sturmtruppen. We were the point of the spear, the first wave, tasked with infiltrating the enemy lines and carving paths for the regular infantry to follow. Lieutenant Hoffman slid down beside me, his breathing controlled but rapid. 5 minutes, Weber. Remember, bypass strong points, find the weak spots. Penetrate as deeply as possible. The follow-on battalions will handle the rest. I nodded, checking my equipment one last time. The newly issued MP-18 submachine gun felt reassuringly solid in my hands. A revolutionary weapon for close-quarter combat. 10 killers awaiting the whistle that would send us into hell. At 0435 precisely, a green flare arced overhead. We were up and over the parapet before it reached its apex. No whistle, no shouting, no dramatic charge. That was old tactics. We moved in silence, broken into small groups, flowing across no man's land like shadows. The gas lingering. From our earlier bombardment concealed our advance. Through my mask, the world had a greenish, distorted quality. The French outpost line, what remained of it, lay 100 meters ahead. The first French machine gun opened up, firing blindly into the mist. Too high. We dropped to our stomachs and crawled forward. This was why we survived when others died. This was why they called us Stormtroopers. The previous day had been spent rehearsing the attack on ground, marked out to match the French defenses. Every man knew his role, his path, his targets. We had studied the aerial photographs until we could navigate the enemy trenches in our sleep. This was the new way of war. No more mass assaults against prepared positions. Instead, we would infiltrate, exploit, encircle. The Houtier tactics that had broken the Russians at Riga. Our company had been pulled from the line 2 weeks earlier, transported to a training ground 20 kilometers behind the front. There we joined soldiers selected from other regiments to form Sturmbataillon Nr. 5. The best men, the strongest, the most aggressive. We trained from dawn until dusk, learning the new tactics, adapting to the specialized equipment. Flamethrowers, light machine guns, trench mortars, the weapons of modern warfare. I had been a carpenter before the war. That seemed like another lifetime now. 3 years on the Western Front had changed me in ways I couldn't articulate. I had served at Verdun, survived the Somme, endured the endless mud of Flanders. Now I was a stormtrooper, one of the Kaiser's elite soldiers. My family wouldn't recognize the man I had become. Our barracks were better than the front lines, but Spartan by civilian standards. 10 men to a room, straw mattresses, a small stove that struggled to keep the winter chill at bay. After dinner, some men wrote letters home. Others played cards or cleaned their weapons. I usually sat alone, sketching in a small notebook. Drawings of ruined villages, dead trees, cratered landscapes, never people. I couldn't bring myself to draw people anymore. Feldwebel Brandt entered the barracks, his face grim. "Inspection in 30 minutes, he announced. "Full kit. We move out at 2100 hours. The room erupted into activity. We had expected this. The battalion had completed its training cycle. Now we would be deployed for the spring offensive, Germany's great gamble to win the war before the Americans arrived in force. Müller, a former butcher from Hamburg, checked his flamethrower for the 5th time that day. "You think we'll break through this time, Max?" he asked quietly. I shrugged, adjusting the straps on my assault pack. "We'll break their front line. After that, who knows? The officers say we'll be in Paris by summer." The officers said, "We'd be home by Christmas in 1914. Müller laughed softly. "True enough. Still, these new tactics like they worked at Caporetto at Riga. The Italians and Russians aren't the French or British," I countered, but without conviction. Part of me wanted to believe. After years of stalemate, of watching men die by the thousands for a few meters of mud, the idea that we had finally found a way to break the deadlock was seductive. Brandt returned, moving through the room, inspecting each man's equipment with meticulous care. When he reached me, he paused. "Your MP-18 is clean?" "Yes, Feldwebel. Cleaned and oiled this morning." He nodded, satisfied. "Good. You'll be leading the 3rd Assault Group tomorrow. Hoffman will brief you en route." My stomach tightened. Leading an assault group meant additional responsibility, but also a greater chance of not returning. "Understood, Feldwebel." That night, we moved up to the front in trucks, covering most of the distance under the cover of darkness. The last 5 kilometers we marched on foot, maintaining strict noise discipline. No talking, no smoking, no unnecessary equipment that might clank or rattle. The French had ears everywhere, and surprise was essential to our tactics. We reached our jumping-off positions at 0200 hours. The assault trenches had been dug in advance, just 80 meters from the French outpost line. We settled in to wait for the artillery preparation. 4 hours of relative quiet, each man alone with his thoughts. I checked and rechecked my equipment, more from habit than necessity. The MP-18 was loaded with a 32-round drum magazine. I had 4 more magazines in my assault pack. My Luger pistol was secured in its holster on my right hip. 6 stick grenades within easy reach. A trench knife, wire cutters, a gas mask, 2 canteens of water, iron rations for 3 days. Everything a stormtrooper needed to operate independently behind enemy lines. At 0400 precisely, our artillery opened up. Thousands of guns firing in a coordinated barrage. The ground shook continuously, and even in our relatively protected position, we had to shout to be heard over the din. The bombardment focused on the French artillery positions and command centers, leaving much of their front line intact. Another change in tactics. We would deal with the front.
Line ourselves. Lieutenant Hoffman crawled along the trench, stopping briefly beside each man.
When he reached me, he handed me a map. "Your group will focus on this section," he said, pointing to a salient in the French line. "Intelligence believes there's a machine gun nest here and a company command post here. The gas should neutralize the machine gun. You take out the command post." I studied the map, committing the details to memory before handing it back. "And after we break through, follow the communication trench here. It leads to their second line. Cause as much disruption as possible. The regular infantry will be 20 minutes behind you. Those 20 minutes would be the most dangerous. 20 minutes operating behind enemy lines with no immediate support. If we were surrounded, there would be no rescue. Sturmtruppen were considered expendable." "Any questions?" Hoffman asked. I shook my head. "Good luck," he said, then moved on to the next group. At 0430, the artillery stopped. The sudden silence was our signal. The green flare confirmed it. We were up and over, into no man's land. The gas had done its work. The few French soldiers we encountered in the outpost line were either dead or incapacitated, choking and vomiting inside their inadequate masks. We moved past them without stopping. Our objective was deeper, the main trench line. We reached the French wire without taking casualties. The artillery had cut gaps in places, and we carried Bangalore torpedoes for the rest. Long metal tubes packed with explosives, designed specifically for clearing barbed wire. Bauer and Kleinschmidt placed the torpedoes while the rest of us provided cover. The explosions were muffled by the lingering haze of gas and smoke. Through the gaps we went, approaching the French front line from multiple angles. No mass attack here, just small groups of highly trained men exploiting weak points in the defense. The machine gun nest marked on our map was silent. The gas had done its work. 2 French gunners lay slumped over their Hotchkiss, their faces blistered and swollen beneath their masks. The weapon itself was intact. Schultz, our machine gunner, quickly turned it around, setting it up to fire down the length of the French trench. Now it would kill its former owners. We split into 2 teams as planned. Schultz and 3 others would hold this position, using the captured machine gun to pin down any French counterattack. I would lead the remaining 5 men to the company command post. The communication trench was narrow and deep, forcing us to move in single file. I took the lead, MP-18 at the ready. The pre-dawn gloom and lingering smoke limited visibility to a few meters. We moved quickly but cautiously, knowing that surviving French soldiers would be recovering from the initial shock of our infiltration. We encountered our first resistance 50 meters in. A French sergeant and 2 privates rallying after the barrage. They saw us at the same moment we saw them. No time for grenades. I squeezed the trigger of the MP-18, its distinctive burp echoing in the confined space. The sergeant went down immediately, a spray of 9mm rounds catching him in the chest. The 2 privates returned fire with their rifles, the reports deafening in the narrow trench. Miller cried out behind me, struck in the shoulder. Koch, our grenadier, lobbed a stick grenade over my head. The explosion filled the trench with dust and fragments. When it cleared, the 2 French soldiers were down. "I'm fine," Miller grunted, pressing a field dressing to his wound. "Keep moving." We pushed on. encountering sporadic resistance. Most French soldiers we faced were disoriented, caught between shifts, many still half asleep when our bombardment began. This was by design. Our intelligence had determined that this was when the French front line would be at its weakest. The company command post was in a deep dugout, reinforced with timber and sandbags. A signaller stood guard at the entrance, cigarette in hand. He never had a chance to raise the alarm. Becker took him out silently with his trench knife. I signaled to Coke, who handed me 2 grenades. I pulled the pins, letting the spoons fly off, counted to 2, then tossed both through the dugout entrance. The twin explosions were followed by screams and curses in French. We stormed in immediately, moving through a short passage into a larger room. 4 French officers were down, either dead or wounded from the grenade blasts. A 5th was staggering to his feet, pistol in hand. I fired a short burst from the MP-18 and he collapsed across a table strewn with maps. "Clear," Hoffman called from a side chamber. "Clear here," I responded. We had taken the command post with minimal resistance. Step 1 complete, but our mission was just beginning. Now we needed to exploit the breach, pushing deeper into the French defenses before they could organize a coherent response. I moved to the table, examining the maps left by the French officers. They showed the disposition of forces in this sector, including reserve positions and artillery batteries. Valuable intelligence. I rolled them up and stuffed them into my assault pack. Becker discovered a field telephone, miraculously still operational. "Should I cut the wires?" he asked. "No," I replied. "Leave it. We can use it to feed them false information before we go." Outside, the sound of gunfire was intensifying. The follow-on waves of our attack would be hitting the French line by now, regular infantry moving through the gaps we had created. It was working exactly as planned. I gathered my men. We push on to the second line. According to these maps, there's an artillery observation post 300 meters east. That's our next target. We moved out, following a communication trench that led toward the French rear areas. The trenches here were better maintained, with wooden duckboards preventing the worst of the mud. Evidence that we were moving into areas normally behind the front lines. The rifles report shattered the morning quiet. Through my scope, I saw the German sniper jerk once, then lie still. A perfect shot. "Hit," Jenkins confirmed. "Center mass. No movement." We didn't celebrate. Didn't move. Remained in position, watching. German snipers often worked in pairs just as we did. If this one had a partner, our position was now compromised. An hour passed. No response from the German lines. No incoming fire. Eventually, I judged it safe to withdraw. We began the painstaking process of extraction, moving with extreme caution back toward the British lines. We reached our trenches shortly after noon, reporting immediately to Lieutenant Davies. His face showed the relief our news brought. "You're certain it was him?" he asked. "Sniper, German, operating in your sector at dawn," I replied. "Professional equipment and technique. Unless you have more than one, it was him." Davies nodded, slowly. "Thank you, Corporal. This will save many lives." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. One skilled hunter had eliminated another. Tomorrow, the Germans would send someone to eliminate me. That night, I cleaned my rifle, with special care, checking each component, oiling the moving parts. Jenkins meticulously recorded the day's work in his log: location, conditions, range, result. The businesslike documentation of a man's death. "They'll send another," he said quietly as we prepared for sleep. "Yes," I agreed. "And if not him, someone else. And if not me, someone else." The wheel turns. 3 weeks later, Jenkins was killed by a German sniper near Passchendaele. A clean shot through the head as we were returning from a mission. I never saw the marksman who took him, never had a chance for revenge. I received a new spotter, trained another 3 months, accounted for 14 more confirmed kills. Then my luck ran out near Cambrai in 1917. A German bullet took me through the left lung, not immediately fatal, but enough to end my war. In a military hospital in England, a doctor told me I'd never fully regain function in my left lung. My sniping days were over. I received the military medal, a disability pension, and a train ticket back to Wales. I returned to my former profession as a gamekeeper after the war. The skills were the same: patience, fieldcraft, marksmanship. But something fundamental had changed. I no longer took satisfaction in the kill. The clean shot that dropped a pheasant or brought down a deer left me cold inside. At night, I sometimes dream of those long vigils in no man's land. The weight of the rifle in my hands, the face of a distant German in my scope, the momentary connection between hunter and hunted, predator and prey, then the shot, the fall, the entry in the logbook, another hash mark in the tally of war. I never learned the name of the German sniper I killed that dawn. Never knew if he had a wife, children, parents who grieved his loss. He was simply a target, as I was to those who hunted me. Impersonal, yet intensely intimate. The duel of snipers played out across the blasted landscape of the Western Front. The politicians called it the war to end all wars. But I knew better. As long as men drew breath, they would find reasons to kill one another. And there would always be those like me, the patient hunters watching through their scopes, fingers resting lightly on triggers, waiting for the moment when one life ends by the deliberate action of another. Sometimes on autumn mornings when mist hangs over the Welsh valleys, I find myself automatically calculating range, wind, drop, and drift as I observe a distant figure through my hunting glass. Old habits. The training never leaves you. The hunter always remains,